All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this, the sixth meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I remind everyone present, please, to turn off their mobile phones and other devices that might interfere with the sound equipment. We have apologies this morning from Dennis Robertson, the Deputy Convener, and we have Joan McAlpin as a substitute. I think Joan's running a little bit late, as indeed a number of our other members appear to be perhaps wrong-footed by the 9:30 start, but I'm sure they will appear shortly. Now, on the agenda this morning, we have two panels of witnesses to give evidence on the Scottish Government's report on proposals and policies 2. Our first panel, joining us, I'll introduce from the left, we have Norman Kerr, who's Director of Energy Action Scotland, Andrew Falk, who's Policy Manager for Energy at Consumer Focus Scotland, Dr Mark Winscoll, who's Research Coordinator, UK Energy Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh, and Neil Stewart, who's Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. Welcome to you all. Before we get into questions, does anybody want to say anything by way of a brief introductory statement? No? Happy? Neil? You were smiling.
I'm happy just to go straight into questions.
Into questions, fine. Okay, well maybe I could start off just to get the ball rolling, and members can perhaps catch my eye if they want to come in with questions. We've seen the publication of RPP2. One of the issues that's arisen as a result of that is that there has been a shortfall in meeting the reduction following the proposals from RPP1. Do you have a view on whether what's proposed in RPP2 adequately sets out proposals and policies that will compensate in future years for the missed target in 2010? And you want to take that? Neil Stewart. Yeah.
I'll maybe start. I mean, obviously, I'm here today to represent the organisation which represents the renewable energy industry in Scotland, and I would say, if I focus my remarks on that particular sector, I don't think people can argue about the success of the growth of renewables in Scotland. We've seen something like an 80% increase in the capacity of renewable electricity installed between 2007 and 2011. The figures we've already provided the committee in terms of the decline in carbon emissions from Scotland's fossil fuel power stations, showing a 35% decrease in carbon emissions from our 3 fossil fuel power stations between 2006 and 2011. So I don't think anyone can argue that there's been a fairly dramatic shift and decline in emissions from the power sector, and the reasons for the missed target lie with other parts of the economy or other parts of the strategy of the Scottish Government about the wider climate change targets.
I'm not quite sure that answers my question, Neil. I mean, do you think that what's proposed in RPP2 is going to make up for the shortfall that followed as a result of RPP1?
It's difficult for me to answer that question about the broader climate change targets, because there's an awful lot in there which I would not pretend any great expertise or which Scottish Renewables doesn't have a particular focus on. Okay. But again, speaking for my own particular sector, I think our members are comfortable that we can meet the parts of RPP that talk about renewables. I think we're comfortable that we see enough development in the pipeline to meet that 100% renewable electricity target, and with things like the extension of the RO for biomass to 15 megawatts, the introduction of renewable heat incentive, the Scottish Government undertaking work to map out barriers to district heat, the Expert Commission district heat. I think there's enough in there to ensure that we hit that 11% renewable heat target. So in terms of our part of the sector, or our part of the challenge, yes, I think there is enough in RPP2 to meet those targets.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else like to comment on that? Norman.
Make a brief comment, Convener. I think what we have is, in the proposals, a fair amount of detail and a focus on some of the technical annexes that talk about the National Retrofit Programme achieving in 2013 59 kilotons of carbon reduction, yet in 2017 that's grown to 207. But the budget line for the National Retrofit Programme remains flat. So I struggle to understand how we can quadruple almost the carbon abatement in that particular programme when we've got a flat budget line. So I think the aspiration is there. What I don't think we have in the document is the detail around the policy about how that will be achieved.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically there is a contextual, the business climate for delivery of policy in energy has become more difficult. So I don't find it particularly surprising at the high level that we are struggling on a year-by-year basis to meet ambitious targets. So I think the other aspect of the question is the level of detail in RPP2 to correct the trajectory. And I don't know a huge amount on the sort of level of details of some of this, but I did find the document rather vague in places. And although the overall envelope, certainly out to 2020, is convincing, and there are statements to the effect that this is not a serious concern, I think after 2020 there are lots of uncertainties about the details, about the overall trajectory relative to EU ETS. So I probably wouldn't be especially concerned about annual fluctuations, but I think the overall shape of the trajectory, particularly post-2020, there's lots of questions.
Andrew, do you want to say something?
I can echo, I think, Norrie's comments on the detail, and also Mark's comments on the plan. Unlike Neil, we're not able to comment on the trajectory and the emissions overall. But what I would say is it's quite difficult to equate what happens at the policy end with what gets delivered as you read the document from our perspective of not being experts in this area.
There's quite a lot in what you've said that I think we need to pursue, and I'm sure other members will come in. I wanted to just add another specific question and then open it up to other members. And it's going back to something, Andrew, that was in your submission from Consumer Focus Scotland that I was quite interested in, where you're talking about the need for there to be comparative costs and benefits of different measures integrated in the report, so that the balance between the different actions could be compared, and also the balance of costs to consumers, public sector and industry, which need to be fair and transparent. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit and explain why you think that's important? And then perhaps I could ask the others after that if they agreed with that comment.
Okay. I would start from the position that the majority of consumers, regardless of their views as citizens, climate change is not an immediate and pressing concern for most people in their daily lives. Yet, you still have the situation, though, where climate change policy, public policy, is going to affect them. I mean, particularly kind of in the context of rising energy costs, changes to the energy generation mix. Now, there's pretty good evidence that consumers, when they understand this stuff, sympathise with it to some extent. But they also want to see that there's a balance between what they're paying and what energy companies are paying and what government is putting in. And, that come back to some of the work my colleagues in London have done under the General Who Pays banner. What that really showed, I think, was that it's more difficult to engage consumers in this debate where you have the context of rising energy costs, but at the same time rising energy profits. Equally, you need to make sure that the public sector, in the widest sense, is seen to be delivering across all areas, because consumers are also very good at spotting inconsistencies.
Does anybody else agree with the comment from Consumer Focus Scotland about the need for greater transparency in terms of costs? Norman?
I think very much so. What we have is we have consumers who struggle to understand their energy bills currently. And there's a lot that Ofgem are trying to do around that through the liquidity review of the wholesale market, for example. It's a big part of the market that consumers don't understand. I think in terms of the fuel poor consumer is not particularly interested where the energy comes from, whether that's through a lower carbon energy or whatever. It's, can I actually afford to use it? I think we need to get to a stage where we have engaged consumers, which we don't have just now. They are looking at, we're saying one thing as a government, as campaigners, but quite often our actions are entirely different to that. we talk a lot about helping consumers, but actually it's consumers paying for the help that we already have, and this is something that Energy Action Scotland's banged on about for a long while. We hear energy companies saying we're giving consumers rebates, but those rebates are not coming from the profits of the energy companies, they're coming from the consumers themselves. So I think it is very hard for consumers to be engaged in this type of discussion without knowing the full picture. And I don't think they'll enjoy the full picture until we actually get some clarity into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the broad comment about this is a minor part of the average consumer's sets of concerns is an important one, actually, for all of us who are much more preoccupied with this. The other thing is that the general kind of the benign context has changed, so that's gone away. We know that household incomes are flat. We know that fuel poverty is an increasing problem. So consumers are going to notice more about that. The energy has become more of a visible aspect of household spending. And what that means for carbon and climate policy, I think one thing is that it's important to counter some of the myths that are out there in terms of the causes for the recent years' increase in bills. So we know that carbon policies are a fraction of the overall cause of increases, that by far the majority of contributed cost increases have been gas prices, internationally traded gas prices. And that isn't always the perception. You know, there is a kind of conflation of carbon policy with bills increase. Now we know that the price on people's bills for carbon policies is going to increase out to 2020 and beyond, but we know where that stands roughly. We know it's going to be moderate increases. We heard Alistair Buchanan saying yesterday that there's going to be pressure on gas prices, certainly over the short term, out to towards 2020. So the other sort of version of the future, which has been quite prominent recently, is that unconventional gas is going to cause a rapid kind of decrease in gas prices. That all the assumptions in DEC and Scottish Government about gas price escalation is going to make the carbon measures relatively more expensive. I think that there's very little evidence for that, actually. We've conducted work in UK Energy Research Centre on gas price scenarios and in the sort of dynamics of gas markets. Now, there's huge amounts of uncertainty, but the sort of balance of evidence is that we're not going to see a dramatic change, a reduction in gas prices based on unconventional gas in Europe, at least over the next several years. So again, that's something that, in terms of perception of the drivers of cost increases, that needs, evidence-based statements to just counter a few myths out there. I think on cost transparency is quite a difficult one on supply side, because there are still huge amounts of uncertainty about, which cost for whom. But I think in terms of a lot of the work that we do looking at supply side costs, it's quite a difficult picture. The things that we assumed a few years ago about CCS being brought into the system by around 2020 and making a significant impact by then. The cost trajectory of offshore wind, in the wider UK context, the cost estimates around nuclear, all have gone in difficult directions. There are huge ambitions for 2020 around cost reduction for things like offshore wind, but the actual track record of projects coming on board, I might be able to say more, but we've seen a pattern of pressures on supply chains and some tendency to cost increases rather than decreases. So that's quite a difficult one. It is also a highly uncertain one. So transparency isn't always there as we'd like it.
Yeah.
I think it's how could anybody argue against greater amounts of information and greater transparency, that can only be a good thing. I think one of the things that's implicit in that statement, or one of the things I'm guessing that's implicit in that statement, is alludes to the debate around should we be spending money to promote renewable and other low carbon forms of generation, or should we be spending more money to save and reduce energy use. So just a couple of things maybe highlight on that particular issue. One is, I don't think we should overlook how ambitious the Scottish Government's energy efficiency commitment of 12% by 2020 is. And energy efficiency and energy reduction is something that's been long talked about, but has proven very, very difficult for government and the wider public sector to actually engender and foster and change behaviours. And likewise, I think, I don't remember the exact figure, but I think in here there's a commitment in this year, in the next 2 years in this spending period, to spend something like £70 million on domestic energy efficiency measures, which is, I'm guessing, far in excess of the direct spend that the Scottish Government will make to support the promotion or the government spend on the promotion of electricity or other energy generation from renewables. And the last thing I would say is one area I think where there is a massive need for more information and proper study is around the area we've talked about, fuel poverty. And is it the rising costs of energy that's putting people into fuel poverty? Is it really the additional costs that are required to support investment in renewable energy, or is it pressure on household income that's resulting in increased fuel poverty, or is it the quality of our housing stock and the poor energy efficiency of our housing stock? Because my guess would be that if we compare Scotland to other parts of the UK, other parts of Europe, the main driver of fuel poverty in Scotland is pressure on household income, and it's the poor quality of our housing stock. It's not the main driver is not rising energy costs. And again, Alistair Buchanan, in his interview on Radio 4 yesterday, said quite clearly, in terms of the cost of gas, the UK is very low in European terms, and in terms of the cost of electricity, it is decidedly average in terms of cost terms. So that's why I think we need to do a little bit more to understand exactly the dynamics of fuel poverty and what's driving that. Is it household income, is it the cost of energy, or is it the quality of our housing stock?
Okay. There's a lot of issues come up there, and I'm sure members will want to pursue them, but a couple have caught my eye, so I'll bring them in. I'll bring Rhoda Grant in first.
Just really following on from Murdo's questioning, if you were designing RPP2, what would you have put in that maybe is missing from this document?
Detail. I think it's as simple as that. We have a lot of statements, but we have no detail around it. It talks about further technical advancements in 2018. I don't know what they might be, and I'm thinking that whoever wrote that had a crystal ball, because I don't see anything on the horizon that would deliver the amount of carbon reduction that we're talking about in 2018. I think we're pushing off the evil day, a bit like we did with the fuel poverty targets, when we said, there is a responsibility to eradicate fuel poverty by 2016. And when we set that in 2002, 2016 was a long way off, and it's only now that we're kind of waking up to that. So I think what we've got here is a very similar document, that we're saying that we're going to do a lot of things, but we're pushing the evil day when we actually need to do them further and further away with little detail. So if I was going to write anything further in the document, it would be to expand upon that detail.
Okay.
I'm sorry that's a very non-answer, but I think that's the best I can give you.
Can I just come back to you on that? When you say it lacks detail, from what you were saying, it almost lacks substance, is what you're saying, because what they're saying is almost they are still committed to the target. However, there is no pathway towards those targets other than maybe a wing and a prayer.
I think that would be a fair assessment.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd probably start by stepping back a little bit. I mean, one thing is the read across from RPP1 to RPP2, and I know some of the other submissions that have come in to the committee have picked up on this. I haven't been closely involved in RPP2, RPP1 sort of evidence, but when I tried to read across from documents, I actually found that quite difficult because the way the information is presented in the different sectors isn't consistent between the two documents. So the levels of aggregation for the different policies and proposals are different. I think it's much more aggregated in RPP2 between UK, Scottish, European measures, whereas that was disaggregated in RPP1. Some of the kind of costing tables are different as well. So there is a lot of detail in the technical annex on an annual basis in terms of cost and impact of policies, but it isn't presented in a consistent way which allows easy read across. So I found that just a difficult kind of exercise in trying to understand, there are general statements about where have we got to at the sectoral levels, at the chapter introductions, but actually in the detailed comparison across tables and the data, I find that rather difficult to make any assessment about the levels of ambition and the levels of firmness about the policies or proposals. I think other people are going to say things about the level of detail, and perhaps in the second panel as well, people are going to make those points. I mean, from the kind of work that we do in UK Energy Research Centre, I think one thing we have learned over the last couple of years doing projections, scenarios, model runs, is that things are a bit more uncertain than we'd imagined a few years ago. So cost of technology isn't as predictable over these scenarios than we'd thought. We can't get easy cost reductions as easily. Doing big projects is difficult at the moment because of things like capital availability. I think on the demand side, there's been less traction than we'd thought. I think we can often assume that these are fairly easy sort of low-hanging fruit, and they haven't proven to be as we haven't had traction in some of these areas. And I think on heat, we're going to see a lot more detail over the next few weeks and months, at the UK level and Scottish levels. Yeah.
Is what you're saying is that the document is so unpenetrable that you can't really answer the question as to is there something missing, is there something you would add to this, other than a degree of clarity?
It's not just about clarity. I mean, one of the things is where can you be predictable and where can you be firm about? I think over the period to 2020, we'd be looking for quite a high level of detail in terms of policy, investment, where the investment is coming from, different levels, UK, Scotland, public, private, and the consistent read across from RPP1. I think there's a difference then past 2020. What I would be looking for from a document of this kind is a series of kind of what-if exercises. So we don't know what gas price is going to do in the 2020s, really. Anyone who predicts that is probably underestimating uncertainty. If we don't know about levels of demand. There are important interactions on the heat side, for example. If we get conservation efficiency right in homes, then levels of heat demand decrease substantially in the 2020s. So we have to look at alternative assumptions about demand, because that affects things for markets like district heating. There is a particular issue, I think, around the interaction with EU ETS and the traded sector. So at the moment, RPP2 assumes that EU ETS, because there is a lot of uncertainty about what happens to EU ETS post-2020, the default position in RPP2 is to take essentially a Scottish trajectory for traded sector emissions based on Scottish targets for decarbonisation. The problem with that is that Scottish targets are very ambitious on electricity. So in the EU ETS context, that's likely to overburden the traded sector. And so it's kind of letting off the non-traded sector post-2020 from what we think might happen. So EU ETS is likely to continue in some form post-2020. We don't know the level of ambition. Getting Europe to sign up for a 30% by 2030 target has proven very difficult. So this is, again, one of these areas where we need some what-if thinking. So if EU ETS does establish an 80% target, then what are the implications for the non-traded sector in Scotland? That's crucial. If it's a 60% target, then there is a higher level of burden for the non-traded sector in Scotland. If the ETS disappears altogether, then we're into the realm of the current position in RPP2. Now, that's not resolvable at this stage, you know, and within Scotland, that's clearly that's one of those exogenous things. But it has serious implications for delivery of policy. So what's really needed for those longer term implications, going out to 2027, is explicit treatment of these different possible forks in the road, and that's missing. I think uncertainties are discussed in the technical annex, but in a very qualitative, descriptive way, and then you get the kind of table of assumptions with no sense of what's the confidence in these assumptions. What would be interesting to see is how much confidence there is in these in this data, and can we make kind of low, high, sort of medium range alternatives to see just how sensitive policy delivery is to some of these uncertainties, because the uncertainties aren't going to go away in a hurry over the longer period.
Oh, sorry, Neil. Sorry, you can see that.
Just a couple of brief comments. The first obvious thing that's missing is the chart that we had to produce on behalf of the Scottish Government in our evidence to show that the balance, the broad package of European, UK and Scottish Government measures have already had, a massive impact on emissions from the power sector in Scotland, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of, what else would I say? In terms of electricity, the 100% target, we all know, is a demanding and ambitious target, but we believe the broad package of measures is in place to give us the best possible chance of meeting that target. If we look at renewable heat, as I said to the committee during the inquiry into the Scottish Government's targets, heat is a much more difficult area. The blocks and the barriers to investment in renewable heat are less well understood. There are more constraints on things like the fuel stock. The economic intervention of the renewable heat incentive has only recently been introduced, is not well understood. It's not clear if that's going to transform investment in renewable heat the way that the RO has done for the electricity sector. So the thing that we really want to see here, and which isn't here, is a clear commitment from government to essentially go back to basics and first principles in terms of how we put in place a package of measures which promote renewable heat and don't just get us up to that 11% renewable heat target by 2020, but get us on the trajectory to meet the commitment which is in here, which is to largely decarbonise the energy for heat by 2050.
I suppose if I was to go back to what's missing, it would be something that's, in fairly simple language, says this is what it's going to look like if you're a household in Scotland 10 years from now. And it is going to involve a degree of energy efficiency, and it is going to involve a degree of renewable heat, and it probably will involve a wider series of actions and a wider series of adaptations. But it's quite difficult to take the RPP as it stands and translate that back to the level of an individual household. And if you're looking for that wider degree of engagement, which I think we will need to be if you're going to get buy-in from people as a whole towards this, we need something that's a bit simpler than what we've got just now.
I think it was in your own evidence you talked about the different schemes available to householders and how they joined together and how almost impenetrable they were for people looking at that. Are you saying that there should be something alongside this that speaks to individuals saying, and this is what your contribution could be, and this is how you access the funding around it, and this is how you go about it? Is that the kind of thing?
Yes. I would say, as we said in our submission, the kind of front end of the RPP2, it's a bit more, there's more kind of enthusiasm saying this is how a low-carbon Scotland is going to be better. There's areas of job opportunities which clearly didn't exist in the past, which will in the future. There ought to be more of that, how can I put this, pulling towards the golden future, rather than saying climate change is going to, sort of damn us into an eternal night. And that kind of, the positive language and what this means at a household level is what we haven't got in this. And therefore the debate remains at an extremely high level rather than one that means something.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Martin.
Yes, before my questions, just one little point. You had said before that the projections on gas price by the Scottish Government and DEC included a plunge on the basis of unconventional gas. That's not an RPP. What's the source for that from the Scottish Government?
No. The DEC and Scottish Government assumptions are about gas price inflation.
Right.
It's more that in the sort of policy debate, there is a kind of some of the think tanks, some sort of research groups have been publishing materials recently about the need to. I mean, that's partly it.
I was aware it had crept
okay,
into the debate.
yeah, right.
I just thought from what you said that it got into the
Yeah,
realm
I think
of
the point I
official
was making
projections.
was there are some uncertainties about the longer term impact of some of these things. You know, and there's all kinds of global effects, that knock-on effects about what's happening in the States with unconventional gas, and so I think there's less confidence about sort of medium, longer-term projections around gas than there was.
And similarly, one of the points that's in there about the decarbonisation of the electricity supply is a rollout of partial functioning CCS by 2020. In your view, how realistic do you think that is?
Well, I had meant to mention CCS as one of these uncertainties because certainly we've learned that doing CCS anywhere in any country at the moment, you know, there's things happening in parts of the world. Canada, Australia are doing interesting things, but generally CCS isn't where we'd expected internationally when we were looking at this sort of 4 or 5 years ago. So if you read the IEA stuff, they're very concerned about lack of progress on CCS. The need to do CCS hasn't gone away. It's become stronger, if anything, because of, you know, global emissions around fossil fuels. So in the UK, we've had lots of false starts. I think the assumptions in RPP2 aren't unreasonable. I think they're quite reasonable assumptions. I think it's still at the level of setting the ambition rather than the means of delivery. I don't think that's bad. I think it's not saying there's going to be huge amounts of CCS on the system before 2020. It's saying there will be a gradual kind of step up in the 2020s that is quite dramatic around sort of 2025, 2027. So I'm always suspicious about those kind of real kinks in the curve. I think things happen a bit more gradually, generally in reality. I think we still don't know how to get CCS off the ground in the UK context, but I think it isn't going to go away, and we need to get it right. We need to do it.
And do you see any levers open to the Scottish Government within the frameworks it has to operate in that could accelerate CCS in Scotland, or is that something that would be dependent on UK, EU and non-governmental factors?
It's largely, so the experience has been largely at European and UK levels where we've had problems. I think within Scotland we've got a huge kind of research capacity. We've had lots of sort of industry support and proposals. So I think I think we're really still struggling at EU and UK levels. Whether there's more that could be done at the levels of detail in Scotland, I'm happy to get back to you about that one. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to come in on CCS?
Just briefly, I think at best by 2020, as Dr. Vinskill's already said, there'll be extremely limited capacity of carbon capture and storage. I think it's more likely to be within the timescale of the targets that are set out for aspirations that are set out for 2030. But if people are concerned about the costs of renewables, then they need to be, I would say, even more concerned about the costs of CCS, because I think on most projections for cost for CCS, it comes out more expensive than nuclear. It comes out significantly more expensive than onshore wind and biomass.
Can I ask
One more.
at the not on CCS, but perhaps to yourselves, actually, the other half of the panel. There's been a suggestion from some stakeholders that that's emphasised the importance of compulsion in energy efficiency retrofitting to reach the hard to reach areas, the hard to reach households. Do you think that is necessary, and what would you say would be the strengths and weaknesses of any compulsion-based approach to require retrofitting in households?
I could start on compulsion. It's a very difficult route to go down, and we understand that. But I think undoubtedly there needs to be compulsion. We've given the socially rented sector, the housing associations and local authorities compulsion in that they must meet Scottish Housing Quality Standard by 2015, and we're talking about increasing that standard, and that's a level of energy efficiency. We've compelled new build to a greater and higher level of energy efficiency. Houses built today use 70% less energy than they did in the 1990s. But we have a particular problem with the private rented sector. The private rented sector has disproportionately more fuel poor households than any other of the housing sectors. It has the poorest performing stock. If you look at the Scottish House Condition Survey, private rented sector stock is significantly behind. It has stock that is classed in the National Home Energy Rating Scheme as the poorest performing stock. And we've dangled carrots in front of that particular group of householders since 1994, and they trail significantly behind. So unfortunately, I think the time has come where we need to say there is an element of compulsion, and the private rented sector should be brought into line with where we are with the socially rented sector. The Scottish Government, through the Housing Strategy Group, are looking at introducing legislation around about 2018. But of course there would need to be a lead-in if we were going to set a target, and it would not be unreasonable to suspect a lead-in of 2 to 3 years. So by 2020-21 we could be talking about a level of energy efficiency. There's no ambition in that, and I honestly believe that we need compulsion in the private rented sector much sooner, and I don't believe there's anything to stop us from introducing regulation by 2015 that would mean by 2018 we had houses at a standard that reduced the level of demand for energy within those homes and actually made them affordable to live in.
I would echo that. I'd just say as well, if you look at the circumstances of the people who are living in F and G rated houses, the poorest performing ones, your rates of fuel poverty in that official Scottish Government figures are somewhere around the 60-65%. That's twice the rate of fuel poverty, more than twice the rate of fuel poverty for the average for Scotland as a whole. There aren't that many houses in that position. As Norrie says, the incentives have been available to them for some time. There's not been a change in that number of houses over the last 2-3 years. So clearly the incentives-based approach is not working. We do need to do something for the sake of the people who live in those houses.
Thank you. Right. Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I'd just like to carry on that theme. First of all, Norrie, you said earlier that you felt there was nothing on the horizon, let alone any early action. How do you think RPP2 deals with dates around a national retrofit programme? Do you think it needs to be far more robust?
I think if we look at the carbon abatement targets, and there's a line along the National Retrofit Programme, we can actually see that the expectation from the impact of the National Retrofit Programme in reducing carbon, as I said, quadruples over the next 4 years. but the budget line's flat. So I struggle to see how we get to that. I understand that the National Retrofit Programme will certainly attract other funding to it, for example, the Green Deal and the Energy Company obligation, but that shows a different line in terms of the carbon abatement. That's a separate line. So it's not as though that's been factored in to that increase. So as I say, I struggle on a flat budget line to see how we're going to deliver that increased carbon reduction.
So a real mismatch between the proposal and how we actually achieve that target?
I think there's a lack of clarity, yes.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to pick up on that one? And then I have a question about renewable heat.
I mean, I know less about this, but I do agree with what's been said and the work that we've done in terms of the relative costs of supply side versus demand reduction. I have consistently shown that demand reduction is a very, very attractive way of doing this if you can get it right. So the case for stronger regulation, I haven't looked in any detail at that, but it would seem that there's quite a compelling case if that's not happening. I think the other thing that we've found in some of the projects that we've done is the importance of understanding that this is a kind of it's a different kind of challenge than on the supply side. So you need to understand the kind of context for people's decision making around retrofit and so on. What's really driving that? How much trust they have in the kind of people who come into their homes to all about kind of accreditation, about getting the training right, getting sort of the word out there that this is a reliable service that's being offered, and that just hasn't been sort of tackled yet, I don't think. The other thing that we've been looking at, part of the work that's carried out within UK Energy Research Centre has been looking at the sort of, there's something imbalanced about, because of the nature of electricity market reform and the contract for differences, which are basically providing guaranteed investment opportunities if they get those levels right, and there are difficulties there, but there is a kind of a skewing of the levels of incentives relative to sort of supply investment versus demand reduction. So if the opportunity was there within the EMR to incentivise demand reduction through something like efficiency feed-in tariffs, that's being suggested. Now, DEC are doing a consultation on demand reduction, but it's a follow-on and it's not part of the mainstream EMR process. So as long as you've got that kind of skewing of incentives and investment towards supply investment rather than demand reduction, that just doesn't make sense from an overall kind of system level view.
Thank you. Can I go into renewable heat? Scottish Renewables submission certainly touched on that, and Dr Winscoll's mentioned it too, and certainly in the committee's own inquiry into the government's renewable energy targets, there was a risk identified from the evidence that was taken that the target for renewable heat won't be met. And the government's District Heating Expert Commission came back with 18 recommendations in November, and I understand that we will be hearing more on this area, that the heat generation policy statement will be produced by the end of this year. But I just wondered if you were concerned that there's little evidence, there's little inclusion, I think, of this topic in RPP2. So I just would like to hear the panel's view on how RPP2 deals with the renewable heat target. Is there enough ambition and detail? Certainly, Scottish Renewables submission talks about the fact that the Scottish Government needs to play a transformative role here. Does that mean you want to see more projects like the one in Aberdeen? The council runs at the Aberdeen Heat and Power Company. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, or are there other models that we can look at to boost this much needed initiative? Thank you.
As I said earlier, there's a sense of lots of small initiatives which of themselves will not transform the rollout of renewable heat. So there's the need for an overarching and more coherent strategy and I'll try and make my remarks a bit more strategic and coherent on this as well. But to answer that specific point, I think there's a parallel here to some talk a few years ago of the public sector Pathfinder projects for broadband in rural areas, for example, where health services, education services would provide the critical mass to provide the investment in higher speed broadband in rural areas. And I think the same thing applies here. If we can get the public estate, schools, hospitals and others investing in renewable heat technology, then that will increase demand. Potentially there's spare capacity to roll that out to housing, local housing nearby, and the increase in demand should impact on costs and create a virtuous cycle where as costs come down it becomes more affordable and a more attractive option for more consumers. So I think you're right in terms of RPP setting out lots of little initiatives which of their own will not transform the rollout of renewable heat, and there therefore is the need for government to go away, do some work in this area, consult with the industry, consult more with consumers around the blocks and the barriers, and look at how they can do more to help companies such as Diageo, for example, which are investing massively in renewable heat in their Cameron Bridge facility, something like £150 million. I know that other distilleries, other businesses such as Tullis Russell are doing the same. So how do they get other big industrial facilities to invest in renewable heat? Because by doing so, that will ensure the most rapid progress towards the target. Then how do we do more to encourage renewable heat facilities to be built into new housing schemes? Again, I think social landlords are very much looking at this as a way of protecting their residents from increased bills in the future. So again, how do we get more private sector landlords to do the same? And of course, again, one of the big challenges around fuel poverty, and this again shows the interlinkages here between the themes that are getting discussed. One of the big challenges of fuel poverty is the significant number of people in Scotland who live off the gas grid and therefore have to look to other more expensive solutions for heating. And how do we help open up renewable heat solutions to those households? Because by doing so, we'll have the greatest win in terms of carbon emissions, but we'll also have the greatest win in terms of the impact that would make on their fuel bills and therefore the rates of fuel poverty in those areas. So I don't think that doesn't really answer your question. I think the broad answer is that we welcome the government's commitment to go away and put together all the individual pieces of work that are ongoing into a more coherent and cohesive strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. I would absolutely just echo and follow on from that. I mean, some of the stuff that we've done a research looking at the experience of social landlords using renewable heat, and once they've gone through the learning curve, it's very positive. Very struck by the number of social landlords that came back, or the tenants we interviewed, who said that they were warmer at lower cost. And in this context, warmer at lower cost with significantly less carbon emissions as well. So it works, but it's not something that's commonplace yet. And as Neil says, you need an awful lot more both experience among the industry of doing this so that they're better able to get it right and provide a supply chain and a support network. But also wider perception among members of the public. One of my bugbears in this is that we frequently do projects from technical side, we don't promote them enough. Now, as an example, I believe this building has solar thermal hot water heating. There's no signs in the toilets that say the hot water you're using here is heated by the sun. You need something that demystifies this stuff and makes it relevant. Because if people see it in action in a building like this, they can equally well take it home.
Thank you. Very good point.
Just a point of information. I need to declare an interest as a trustee on the Aberdeen Heat and Power Company. Aberdeen Heat and Power celebrates 10 years in operation this year, and they're now connected not only to domestic consumers but also to a range of commercial consumers as well. So they provide hot water to the Athletes Village. They're working very closely with NHS Grampian, and I think it's that combination where we're able to do. However, what they do say is, if you were to ask them, could they start Aberdeen Heat and Power today? The answer would be no, because of the financial climate that we're in. pulling together that mix of funding that actually gets it off. So to replicate that in other cities, because we need, and Neil's point about the density, you really do need the density of population to make a scheme of that size workable, would be very, very difficult. And I'm sure I can encourage the general manager or others at Aberdeen Heat and Power to put some information down to the committee on the challenges that others might face at this time to start up a similar business. And at the same time, I would also say to the committee, if anybody would like to see Aberdeen Heat and Power in operation, then please feel free to get in touch, and I'd gladly arrange a visit up to Aberdeen for you to view the very good work that they're doing in the city of Aberdeen to reduce fuel poverty, but also to provide additional heat to commercial users around the city.
Thank you very much. Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Where we are on heat at the moment, compared to where we thought we'd be 2-3 years ago, I think there's been less progress. I think that the policies are still rather immature relative to power. So renewable heat incentive has been delayed. We're about to get a heat policy published by DEC next month. I mean, I think DEC are much more interested in renewable heat than they were. I think they understand it better. They've got better tools to see the economic case. I think before it was very much a kind of poorly understood, poorly incentivised, and much of the emphasis was on sort of electrification. Now, I think that's being moved away. I think what's still missing is a convincing business case that DEC are signed up for around things like district heating. Now that's become more difficult because of public sector finances. So there's a strong role for local authorities in district heating. So how to get around that in the present, because I think this is all informed by present availability of capital and investment. So I think you need to rethink how the infrastructure around community heating, district heating, is paid for. So thinking about district heating as partly an infrastructure class investment, where you can achieve lower risk investment, and there are infrastructure funds out there. So it's matching. It's treating some of that as an infrastructure problem, like other infrastructure problems. So there is roles for infrastructure investment, public infrastructure investments. There's the role of Green Investment Bank. I'm involved sort of tangentially with colleagues at Edinburgh, feeding into Scottish Government thinking on heat generation policy statement, and so the heat hierarchy, which has already been published, sets out the broad kind of options for heating, emphasising demand reduction, and then going into renewable heating, and that makes a lot of sense. That's still lacking detail. So what's happening at the moment is that specific kind of options for Scotland are being worked up, and they will talk about community level solutions versus more individual householder solutions, and the relative costs of those for different types of housing stock. So I mean, I'm happy to pass that on. That's very much a work in progress at the moment, and it's perhaps unfortunate that isn't further developed than we hoped it would be by now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I wonder if I can start by referring to I think it's Consumer Focus that said we need more leadership and consistency of approach on the part of government. I attended a meeting 2 weeks ago looking at an ICT system that was looking at public sector buildings, and was appalled at what was going on in terms of maintenance, but primarily the energy efficiency of these buildings. Do you think there's enough focus on what we're trying to do with public sector buildings or not?
I think that people are very much influenced by what they see around them. And I think if there's an inconsistency between the government messages, which are quite clear about the development of renewables, the need for energy efficiency, but then if you happen as a member of the public to visit a building and you just go, well, you know, the heating's cranked up, they've got the windows open to cool it down, that completely undermines the message. I spent, just as a visitor, I spent the weekend in Edinburgh and included a visit to the National Museum of Scotland. It's a great museum. It's a G rating for energy efficiency. It should be better than this, given the footfall. And come back to the earlier comments about, you know, this building's a lot considerably better in terms of energy efficiency. And some is made of that in the visitor experience, and more could be made of that in the visitor experience, I think. But every time you go to a building which undermines rather than reinforces the message, you're starting to lose, I think, a little.
Before you pursue this line of questioning much further, can I just point out there are 4 parliamentary committees that are scrutinising RPP2.
Yep.
I'm advised that the local government committee are specifically looking at a focus on public buildings.
Oh.
So I don't want to overlap what they're doing, and perhaps some of the witnesses here are also speaking to the local government committee. So I think perhaps if you could pursue a different line of
Well,
questioning.
let me try. I'm not sure whether this overlaps. There's great danger of was it too many cooks. In the paper by Consumer Focus, there's a mention of Scottish Water. I don't know if anybody else is looking at that.
That is us. Yeah, we're
That's us. Okay, good. Well, at least we're on song this one. And the comment was that it's surprising that there's so little mention of Scottish Water. Now, Scottish Water can reach every building, every consumer. I mean, I'm a great believer that, notwithstanding state aid, that Scottish Water should consider the creation of a subsidiary to enter the utilities retail market, which might upset the other 6, but it certainly has the customer base to do so. I just wonder why, with the clout, the consumer clout that it has, that Scottish Water is not playing a bigger role or being encouraged to play a bigger role in the whole decarbonisation message.
I'll briefly respond, seeing it was us that raised that as an issue, but essentially our question is your question. And you need to be asking, the sort of perhaps different parts of government or different parts of Scottish Water. We now have the consumer representation role in respect of water, which is why, we touched on that as an issue. But it just seems to me that there's links with water efficiency, and given the amount of energy that Scottish Water uses, there is potential for more to be developed in the context of the RPP. I don't know why this is. I'd welcome you asking different parts of government that question.
Okay, I'm sure we will. Again, another meeting that I had recently was with the Geological Society. We were talking about geothermal energy, and there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of focus on that. We had the article, of course, about Glasgow streets last week, but the conversations that I will be having with the East Ayrshire Council reference the disused coal mines, the amount of warm water that's flowing through there. I mean, why is this not getting the focus that perhaps it should?
Geothermal's been around for a long time, actually. So there's been investigations around relative geothermal in the UK for more than 30 years. It has come back onto the sort of more recent agenda. I've not got inside the kind of the economics of it, but I know there's some interesting demonstration schemes. So I think that the question is, what's the scalability? What's the overall impact relative to policy timelines? So I'd be happy to ask a few colleagues and get back to you, but I suspect it's one of those that's not seen as mainstream. I think a lot of these things. I mean,
it might have your own partner, Dilmellington or Cumnock.
Yeah. Well, I do think locally, I think it's very interesting. I think the national kind of case is, what's the kind of how replicable is the local case and sort of scalability of it. That's the only thing I can point to.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's some specific circumstances in Glasgow and in parts of Ayrshire that make it possible. I don't know if this is a new technology, but clearly I think it's the first time it's been applied in Scotland, and as the question applies, I think other landlords and other people are looking at whether or not they can develop schemes in their area in terms of shallow geothermal. In terms of deep geothermal, I think the barriers are still around technology and around cost, but I know that within academia there's significant interest in looking at how we can make deep geothermal both practicable and economic. But the reason that it's not being rolled out at the moment is because we don't think the technology is there and it can't be done in an economic fashion.
Last question, if I may. Just the Existing Homes Alliance submission indicated that funding for the National Retrofit Programme should be doubled to £130 million in order to maximise impact and lever in private investment. Where's the evidence for that? That private investment will belly up to the bar and say...
I think there is no evidence that the private sector investment will belly up to the bar, as you put it. However, I think that was the phrase you used.
Metaphors.
That's kind of thrown me. If I can look at the budget as it currently stands for this coming financial year, 13-14, the Scottish Government have said they put 65 million into the National Retrofit and Energy Efficiency programmes, because there will be some stuff around the edges of that as well. And they are hoping that they will get 165 million from the energy companies. That's more than they've ever had from the energy companies before. And I think if you're looking at the scale of investment there, what the Go Early projects for the National Retrofit project showed that for every £1 you put in, you could actually get somewhere in the region of 3 back from the energy companies from that kind of sector. So I think the Existing Homes Alliance are saying that's fine for Go Early, and we recognise that, but in the longer term, we cannot be reliant on the energy companies still having the ability to fund our aspirations, because that funding from the energy companies comes from the general public. So therefore, in terms of leading the way and ensuring that Scottish consumers are not left at the mercy of the funding from the energy companies, the Scottish Government needs to take a greater lead. And I think it would be fair to say that if the Scottish Government doubled its funding, then the achievement of the 200, if not more, for programmes is actually a far easier ask than it is just now.
Thank you.
Right, Joan McCall.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yes, could I ask you what your views are on the recent calls by some parties for a moratorium on the building of onshore wind farms, and what effect that would have on our emissions?
I'll maybe go first. I think effectively a moratorium on onshore wind would be a moratorium on all forms of renewables, because it's the revenue stream that onshore wind provides that's allowing Siemens, Vestas and others to invest and develop offshore wind technology that's required to get that industry up to scale. It's the onshore wind sector that's financing, for example, the Beauly-Denny connection and other grid connections in the north of Scotland. And without those connections, one, there simply isn't an offshore wind industry in the north of Scotland, and the Beatrice scheme or the Murray Firth scheme couldn't go ahead. And without Beauly-Denny and other connections in the north of Scotland, quite simply, there wouldn't be any future for the wave and tidal industry. So I can't really put it any more simple than that. A moratorium on onshore wind is effectively a moratorium on all forms of renewable energy, and an end to the trajectory that we've seen in our power sector emissions over the last 5 or 6 years.
Could I ask the other panel members to comment as well?
So, I mean, Yeah, I mean, it's very noticeable in terms of the public debates and going to workshops on sort of policy issues that there is a kind of a backlash around onshore wind, and that's happening south of the border, it's happening here. Now, what's the basis for that, and how widely is that shared across the sort of the wider society? So we do work on public attitudes, and they are randomised, representative, large samples, and the messages there are actually quite positive towards renewables in general, much more so than other technologies. Leaving aside some of the cost issues, but so that, you know, it depends very much on how questions are presented and so on. But this kind of backlash against onshore wind isn't picked up very widely, or at least you would get a misleading impression from some of the kind of stakeholder workshops, I think, because the scientific evidence for that stuff is that basically there's a lot of kind of support for wind power out there still. It's become more difficult, siting has become more difficult as the ambitions have increased. And that's the nature of the targets, you know, that we're trying to do serious work. Onshore wind has a large burden to carry in terms of policy delivery on the Renewables Directive especially, but also on Climate Change Act. You know, onshore wind, if you're looking to do low carbon electricity supply, onshore wind in the UK is the cheapest solution, large scale solution. So, and it's been done for decades and decades. The technology's matured. There are mature supply chains. There's lots of reasons why you do that rather than even sort of, you know, offshore is very interesting. Lots of capacity, lots of sort of interest gearing up, but it's still a relatively mature technology where we're finding kind of cost increases at times. And that's the same for CCS. It's the same for lots of large-scale, low-carbon. You know, there's lots of good reasons to say onshore wind is where a lot of the impact on policy delivery still has to be over the next decade. So the idea of a moratorium, I think, is very unhelpful in terms of the impact on policy delivery. Now, why? You know, what can be done to in terms of planning, spatial planning, community engagement, community incentives around wind schemes, where the UK has been, you know, lagging for years and years and years, and we, you know, talked about stakeholder community ownership of these schemes, which, you know, all the evidence suggests will make things a lot less problematic. But I think there are some myths out there about the kind of reaction against onshore wind. So I don't think there is a strong sort of based on public opinion grounds or certainly on economic grounds for a moratorium.
Just gently point out, for the record, that the demand for the moratorium has come from local authorities whose planning departments are struggling to cope with the level of application.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is problematic, actually, that there is sort of a lot of kind of project-by-project submissions, and so there's a problem about the capacity of the system to deal with that and sensibly kind of spatially plan it. And yeah, so...
There's also a demand, of course, from sort of various pseudo-scientific organisations that purport to argue that onshore wind doesn't actually contribute much to the energy mix. And a lot of these you do find, I live in the south of Scotland, I represent the south of Scotland, and you do find these people quoted regularly by anti-wind farm campaigners in the newspapers, and indeed by politicians looking to capitalise and basically make a bit of political capital out of it. And I just wondered whether any of you could reflect on some of the scientific arguments that have been put forward by some of these anti-wind farm groups that have titles like the Renewable Energy Foundation and that kind of thing, that could perhaps mislead people into thinking that they have a basis in evidence.
I think we're a little bit off topic, but if you can respond to that briefly, Neil. Yeah,
I'm happy to bring us back on. So I think with regards to the subject of today's session, one of the most important pieces of research that has come out in this area is the communication from National Grid to the committee, which shows, despite claims to the contrary, protestations about the ineffectiveness of onshore wind, shows an almost perfect relationship between every megawatt hour of wind displacing the carbon emissions which would have been associated with the generation of a megawatt hour of electricity from gas or coal. And despite the fact that output from wind is variable, despite the fact that there are small fluctuations and differences between forecast and actual output, all of those only eat into something like 0.08% of the carbon savings from wind. We have a very robust model from National Grid which show very clearly the efficacy of wind in terms of displacing carbon emissions from the fossil fuel power section. And I think a lot of I agree with Dr Vinskell, I think the opposition to onshore wind is often overstated, and I think the limited amount of people who do oppose onshore wind often do because they're not aware of the full facts in terms of the cost of onshore wind. So the average consumer across the UK, the support for onshore wind through the renewables obligation added £6 or £7 a year to their bill last year, not the hundreds of pounds that are often claimed. And again, if wind doesn't work, as we often hear, then how come it's managed to contribute something like 20% of the electricity required to meet Scotland's electricity demand last year, and will do so, and will meet a greater amount this year. So I think a lot of that opposition is because people are not aware of the facts in terms of the displacement in carbon emissions and the very, very limited impact that onshore wind is having on people's bills.
Just to add briefly, colleagues of mine at Imperial College looked at some of the studies that you're referring to, and they came out with quite different findings. And the devil's in the detail, actually, because a lot of these, a lot of the kind of assumptions about carbon impacts depends on what you think are the displacement effects. So, what are the kind of knock-on effects of increased wind? And what we found is that some of the assumptions that are in some of these studies around added cost to the system, added need for sort of gas generation, don't reflect how the system actually operates. So there is a lot more flexibility in the system than some of the studies assume, and that's why they come out with quite negative results in terms of the impact of wind on carbon. So there's some work that I can pass on from Imperial College on that. Yeah.
See, there's a slightly off topic of RPP2. John, do you have another question you want to ask on?
No,
on
but I think
RPP2?
Mr Falk wanted to come in.
I was just going to follow up on your original question briefly. And it was to say we've seen the same public attitude work, we've done some of the same public attitude work that other speakers have referred to, very much echo that. There's broad support for renewables, wind in particular. It's stronger where the benefits locally are seen to be stronger. And we did some work looking at the use of community benefit funds associated with wind farms, which also touched on community ownership of wind. And where you've got that, then not surprisingly, at a local level, you get more enthusiasm for this. The other thing is you can tie this back and say community benefit funds represent, particularly in your area, south of Scotland, a sizable stream of funding. One of the suggestions we've made is you can tie that back and start reusing some of that money towards energy efficiency, particularly, again, in rural areas where fuel poverty is highest.
Good morning, gentlemen. The Scottish Government published an energy efficiency action plan alongside RPP1, but it hasn't done so with RPP2. So I just wondered if you could make comment on perhaps the way that the Scottish Government could contribute to the successful implementation of the Green Deal, and whether national schemes can tackle the specific needs of different areas in Scotland, the different areas, for example, in Orkneys, where there's severe fuel poverty, and, different with the Central Belt.
I'll maybe start off. The Green Deal, I think, is a topic that we could spend some considerable time speaking about. I think the jury's still out on whether or not it will deliver on the benefits that it suggests it might. I think the Scottish Government need to look very carefully about the promotion of the Green Deal to particular groups of consumers. The Green Deal is not a programme that's been designed to support, I would suggest, low-income households or houses in fuel poverty, given the financial payback and the period of time over which the finance will be paid back. For example, a Green Deal loan for external wall insulation of £10,000, the householder or whoever is in the house, if it changes hands, that will repay somewhere in the region of £22,000 in finance. That's another mortgage that we're talking about. So I think we need to be very careful about who we promote the Green Deal to and how we see it actively contributing to the wider programmes that we want to do. I think if you look at rural areas, we need to recognise that delivering energy efficiency in rural areas is more expensive. I think it has particular challenges, particularly somewhere like Orkney. The local energy efficiency company in Orkney, Keep Orkney Warm, a number of years ago, had to make application to the roads department when they wanted to bring material into the islands, because the material that they used came in containers that were too heavy to be taken along normal roads, so therefore they had to have a special route. There are particular challenges in rural areas, so I think we need to recognise that there will be additional costs for those challenges, and not always will we receive the reduction in carbon that we think, because people will use that to heat their homes more effectively for longer periods of time, and may actually increase the amount of energy they use because they feel they're getting benefit from that. So I think we do need to recognise that there are a number of programmes on. It would have been useful to have an update to the plan alongside RPP2 as we had with RPP1 to look at the route map moving forward. What is the mix that we perceive between energy company obligation, our new national retrofit programme, whatever that might be called, boiler scrappage, renewable heat? Those things, I think, make up a plan in itself, and it would be a useful tool to engage further with members of the public and indeed local authorities and housing providers if we had that explained in more detail than we have through this document.
Again, I would echo all of that. I think the main it's important if you're developing an energy efficiency scheme, it takes account of the local circumstances. It works through the local trusted delivery bodies. We have a report we're publishing today, which is basically it's reviewing some of the take-up of the Scottish Government schemes. And it's essentially, it's very positive from the consumers who have benefited. But the consumers, we did this on the basis of focus group research, and the consumers who took part suggested ways in which the marketing and promotion end could be more effectively done. And it is working through the trusted local bodies, being very clear about what's on offer, what costs and benefits are. Not least because Scottish Government schemes tend to be kind of free at the point of delivery. Quite often people just don't believe that something is free because they see so many offers that turn out to have small print that undermines that. So there's a point about the delivery side. There's also two issues on the technical side. You know, we're looking at in urban areas with more modern housing. We know what we're doing. Technically, loft cavity wall insulation. There's challenges, particularly for the housing stock, when you're looking at tenement buildings. When what you need to do is get communal agreement in order for measures to be installed. Quite different challenges when you're looking at, somewhere it's more rural, Orkney, Shetland, Western Isles, where you have to think in terms of what's the most appropriate technical measure, solid wall insulation. How do you pay for that, as well as how do you engage people in taking up these measures? I have to say though, I think the Scottish Government has done a great deal of work and made a great deal of progress on this since the original Energy Efficiency Action Plan was published. The engagement we and others have had via the Scottish Fuel Poverty Forum, we see the government taking on board the suggestions we've made for improving these programs. So, as I've touched on earlier, it's not like we've done enough. There's far more to do, but we are, moving in the correct direction.
I mean, just from the outside, really, because it's not an area I know that closely, but I do absolutely think that this is an area where, if there are kind of constrained public sector finances, local authorities are struggling to prioritise some of the expectations around sort of their role in renewable heat and efficiency. I would have liked to have seen in RPP2 a statement of where the priorities lie in a fiscally constrained context, and I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that that good work has been done, but this is very much a priority for limited resource spending, and the change from RPP1 to RPP2, what's been learned about some of the demonstration programs, the limited kind of rollout that's happened, and how is that focusing policy thinking and policy delivery?
The updated plan is going to be published later this year. On the 5th of October 2011, the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure and Capital Investment commissioned a review of the Scottish Government's fuel poverty strategy. Could Norman Kerr perhaps inform me when the Forum will publish its final response to that?
I think the final response may be some time away. There are other bits of work that the Forum wishes to undertake. For example, the committee will be aware that in England, the Department of Environment engaged Professor John Hills to examine the definition of fuel poverty. Professor Hills has brought forward a range of suggestions that Scottish ministers and indeed the Fuel Poverty Forum did not believe were in the best interests of consumers in Scotland, and the Scottish Government have quite rightly, in my view, set aside Professor Hills's findings to say that they would not be adopting his definition of fuel poverty. However, in saying that, the Fuel Poverty Forum recognised that the definition, which had been in use since 1980-82, was something that we should give some consideration to. And the Forum has asked that there is, in Scotland, some research undertaken into the parts around the definition. For example, in Scotland, the definition has a higher threshold in its heating regime. We talk about providing 23 degrees to elderly people for a longer period of time than the English definition of 21 degrees. So we need to look very clearly, I think, about, do we have the constituent parts of our definition fit for purpose? When that research will be undertaken, I can't honestly give you an answer, but I know the Forum has some frustration that we want to move on quickly in that and produce a final report as soon as we can. I cannot give you a time of when that might be.
So we're talking years then, are we?
I would hope it would be months rather than years.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you for that. Could I just ask another question on a different subject?
Briefly, because we're getting behind the clock. So.
Right. On the costs of RPP2, and whether the draft RPP2 is sufficiently clear on where the financial costs of RPP2 will be incurred and by whom.
Mark?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I think it lacks that level of detail, actually. I mean, I think you have to, again, one of the kind of accusations in some of the think tanks at the moment is energy policies suffering from targetism. So everything is specified. There's endless calls for kind of specific kind of policies for delivery in quite an uncertain sort of fiscal context and investment appetite context, and in terms of what technology performance is, I think we've got lots of uncertainties in the system. So I'm slightly averse to highly prescribed kind of targets over medium longer term. I think get away from that really, because we know those things are going to be changed. I think where there is a valid kind of criticism, and I've seen that in some of the written submissions, is that the kinds of level of detail that we'd seen in RPP1 and some of the policy, the commitments around specific policies, it seems to have become a little more aggregated. Budgets are attached to sort of quite broad kind of policy statements around areas for policy rather than specific mechanisms. And part of the problem is actually it doesn't decompose by Scottish and UK and European measures, so it's difficult to get accountability on reading RPP2. So that's almost it's less transparent in that respect than RPP1.
Anyone else?
With regard to energy costs, a huge amount of work has been taken forward by the Committee on Climate Change and the Department for Energy and Climate Change. So I would say, rather than necessarily reprinting or that analysis here or redoing that analysis for the purposes of this document, given that heat and electricity are very much Great Britain-wide markets, maybe there needs to be a clearer reference line drawn to the existing work that's already done by other arms of government.
Mike?
Thank you, Convener. This has been a fascinating discussion, but what's emerging for me here is a picture of immense complexity and with a large degree of uncertainty, and also a number of factors that have been mentioned in the discussion that are absolutely beyond the control of the Scottish Government. And yet we've got calls for RPP2 from some quarters to be absolutely detailed and right down to the nearest watt. And do you think that that kind of level of detail, given that those circumstances or calls for that level of detail, are a bit unrealistic?
I'll maybe start with the bits that are of relevance to the companies and organisations I represent and say I think we have a clearly worked out strategy to hit our electricity targets, and I think people are comfortable that the Scottish Government are going to go away. They've said very clearly and emphatically they're going to go away and develop a new vision and a new policy statement for renewable heat, and that's where the detail will be.
Yeah, thanks. Just anyone else got any thoughts on
Norman?
I understand where Mr Mackenzie's coming from, but I also got to draw you back to the bit that I talked about earlier, where it said the National Retrofit Programme, Scottish Government Fuel Poverty and Energy Efficiency Programmes. So this is something that the Scottish Government does have at its hand, and it talks about the carbon abatement from those policies being 59 kilotonnes in 2013, but rising to 207 kilotonnes in 2017. Now, there is no detail round about that, and I think it's a fair question to say, as I suggested earlier, if the budget that you have as the Scottish Government is flatlined, how can you quadruple your savings with the same budget? What is it that you're going to do differently? What is it that you're going to do instead of? What is it you're going to drop that actually delivers a quadrupling of those energy savings with the same budget line? I don't think that it's unreasonable to ask how the Scottish Government can achieve that when that is within the gift and the remit of the Scottish Government. That's part of its devolved powers. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say, how are you going to achieve it?
Thanks. I think we'd heard, Norrie had mentioned the uncertainty about the energy company obligations and what that will actually produce in real terms on the ground in terms of investment. But that takes me on to the other interesting area, because there's been talk about the reason that we missed the 2010 target was about domestic heat cold winter and so on, and nobody seems to have challenged that, and it seems a reasonable assumption. And so it seems that domestic heat offers a significant area of opportunity for demand reduction. And in the earlier discussion, I think the private rented sector was singled out as the kind of bad boy in the playground, or a donkey that won't accept these carrots that are generously waved in front of its nose. And I just wondered, on terms of that demand reduction in the private rented sector, what's wrong with these landlords? Are they just nasty? Are they stupid? Are they perverse? What's the reason for that?
Maybe they don't have the money.
Well, that's an interesting thought, but I mean, I'm interested to hear from the panel. What's wrong with these people?
If you take, perhaps I'll give an example. If you look at Govan Hill in Glasgow, there's a square mile of Govan Hill that the local community groups tell us have somewhere in the region of 2,000 private sector landlords. And 1 square mile, that's a huge amount of landlords. People who have 1 or 2 homes. They will only change if regulation forces them to change. They're often under the radar, they're not well known, the local authority sometimes only knows about them when someone comes forward with a claim for housing benefit. So I think unless we actually examine more closely what the problem is, and tell people what they need to do by regulation, they will not do it. Why would I, as a private sector landlord, invest £8,000 or £10,000 in a home that I had to make it more energy efficient for the benefit of my tenant, when I can do nothing, absolutely nothing, and still get the same rental from that? I won't do anything unless there's a very good reason. And what I'm saying is, we've tried to offer those, those reasons of being the right thing to do, to support your tenants, to make your home a home that people will want to rent. None of that has worked. So now we're at a stage where I think we need to say, if you want to rent out your property, it has to conform to the following standards. So it may be that there's a combination of all of the expressions that you used for some landlords, and I'm sure if you spoke to the Scottish Association of Landlords or another landlords group, they will tell you undoubtedly that there are many, many good landlords who deliver high quality homes and look after their tenants.
Just in the interest of brevity, Norrie, could I stop you there? Because you've actually,
Sure.
I think I'm very, very grateful to you, because I think you've touched on something that's really quite profound. And I would open it up more generally, that to what extent are market forces, if the private landlord's not going to spend the 10k, and you talked earlier on about the Green Deal, where it's, certainly not an attractive proposition for people in fuel poverty to spend 10k or so in interventions in their house and have that repaid over a long period or whatever. If market forces are not aligning, or do you feel that we could make more progress if market forces were more genuinely aligned with what it is that we're trying to do in terms of this moving towards lower carbon emissions?
Probably yes. I mean, if you take, for example, the Nationwide Building Society have just launched their version of the Green Deal, which offers loans at 3%. Now, you could say the Green Deal was the vehicle that actually has started to impact on lenders to say, there's money to be made here, we can offer something. So that, in some respect, I think the Green Deal has started to spark that off. But it's taken government intervention to do that. The Nationwide Building Society, I very much doubt, would have done that without the Green Deal having been promoted to brought into being, because there was no need. So I think there's a combination of two. It's a lead by government, and certainly there will be market forces that will follow. Not always the case, but in many cases, yes.
Yeah, a couple of other just very brief questions, Convener. The cross-party group on renewable energy, a couple of months ago, there was a community organisation from Fintry who have got, I think, a couple of wind turbines or whatever, and they spend the profits on energy efficiency measures or retrofitting insulation to homes in that area. Terrific project. But what they described was a situation where 4 or 5 years ago, some families that they'd been successful in lifting out of fuel poverty through those kind of insulation measures, loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, are now back in fuel poverty. Do you agree that there are some profound technological challenges in going much further than just the kind of fairly minimal insulation that's afforded by accessible loft insulation and cavity wall insulation?
I think undoubtedly there continues to be technical challenges, but what I would say is if you look at the trajectory over the past few years, Neil Stewart mentioned earlier about examining fuel poverty. The difference in fuel bills between 2002 and 2012 has been £600. The average fuel bill has risen from £600 to £1,300 over that period of time. Energy has taken a huge leap in costs. So despite the good work in insulating some of those homes, there is a challenge there of ensuring that people have the income to support that. You know, if we're talking now of an average energy bill of £1,300 and the welfare reform that we are seeing coming into force in this coming year, if you look at the things that have been said by organisations like the Poverty Alliance and Child Poverty Action, where we see or we believe that many families in Scotland will lose approximately £1,000 in benefits, that's almost the cost of an energy bill that we are taking away from the most vulnerable within society. The technical challenges are there, as Mike McKenzie has rightly said, but they are not insurmountable. We have a growing industry. We're fitting more solar panels, more solar thermal, we're doing more solid wall insulation than ever before, but we still need to scale that up so that those things are making a real impact.
Neil Stewart wants to answer that, so let me come in.
Again, I come back to this need for more analysis on what exactly is driving fuel poverty. So the convener recently on the radio, made a big play about how onshore wind industry was driving up fuel poverty. Onshore wind adds £6–7 a year to the average consumer's bills. Renewables as a whole add £20–21 this year to the average consumer's bills. And I was about to make the point that Norrie made yesterday. I was speaking to a family who lost not £20 a year, but £20 a week from changes to working families tax credit. So is it the £1,000 a year that they've lost from working families tax credit, which is more likely to put them into fuel poverty, or is the £20 a year that the renewables obligation adds to their fuel bill that's going to put them in fuel poverty? So again, early adopters, I think, have already invested in energy efficiency measures. They've gone for the technologies that have the quickest payback. So I think your question's right about, do we need to look at other technologies, new technologies? And there's some points being made around who those early adopters have been to date, and where the difficult next challenges are, and some options for government in terms of how they challenge that.
And that leads me on very nicely just to my final question, because I just wonder that if we have an undue focus on demand reduction or insulation in terms of housing, and not enough on generation as a way of getting to grips with some of these problems. For instance, it strikes me as an absurd situation that Scotland's islands happen to be in areas that are have the greatest renewable energy capability, and yet that's also where we find the greatest fuel poverty, now over 50% on a lot of our islands. And I just wonder if any of you would care to comment on any potential ways that we could maybe even quite simply deal with the fuel poverty on our islands, through generation rather than just thinking about insulation.
The cost of a unit of energy is GB wide. Even if the islands became 100% renewable, that's not to say that their bill would reduce. If you're talking about that for the island, you actually need to take them off grid.
Can I just say why not?
If we're 100% renewable, that renewable energy is sold into the mix. And, as we've heard earlier, Scotland's meeting 20% of its obligation just now by renewable energy. We've not seen the cost of energy go down. the unit cost of energy has not gone down because it's tied to the price of a barrel of oil in the global trading markets. And as long as we continue to have that match, then Scotland could be 150%.
Could I just interrupt you, Norrie? What I was getting at in a sense is I'm aware of a lot of community halls, for instance, that have got wee small wind turbines. They get the feed-in tariff, and then they can choose whether to pump the energy into the grid or use it themselves to heat the building. But we don't seem to be doing that much in domestic situations. And
It's a fair point.
What they get,
somebody else can help.
they get 3 pence a unit, I think, if they pump it into the grid, which they don't get if they use it. So it's really just to clarify that, because I do think there's scope to,
Right.
tick a few
Neil?
boxes here.
But, Mike's talked about an opportunity and a challenge, i.e., for example, in Orkney, no new electricity projects can connect to the grid because the grid's at full capacity, and I know that people are therefore looking at ways in which they can break the link between generation and the national market and actually create a much stronger link between local generation and local demand, and by doing so allow more capacity to come on the system. And I know that generators would be very interested in selling electricity locally at a discounted price rather than being told that they can't generate at all. Now, I'm not very clear what the barriers to achieving that are, but I think there's clearly a role for Ofgem, for National Grid, and for Scottish and Southern Energy's distribution arm to sit down and work out if they can come to a way by which we can turn that challenge into an opportunity which results in more renewable electricity generation, less fuel poverty, and lower energy bills in the island groups, Orkney, Shetland and Western Isles. But I'm not personally entirely clear what the barriers to doing that are.
We've got the energy companies in next week, and we can ask some of this to them. Okay, can I
Thank you.
one final question I want to ask, but we've not touched on yet, in relation to the question of consultation on RPP2. The Scottish Government held 2 formal stakeholder workshops instead of a public consultation on the draft report. Do you think that was an adequate approach to take in terms of consulting?
It's got to be a mix. I think it's to be welcomed that you have stakeholder events. I think I've seen the benefit of stakeholder events for things like the energy companies RIIO, where both Scottish and Southern and Scottish Power have gone out and brought stakeholders together. I think that's a very valuable process. I don't think it replaces ordinary consumer ability to respond individually, because you're not sure you will get all stakeholders to those kind of meetings. So I think it's got to be a mix.
Okay.
I think it would also be helpful if there were very specific questions. This is our job to do this kind of thing, and certainly I struggled with trying to read the entire document and say, well, call for views. I have to decide what my views are. Some guiding questions that said, these are the areas in which we're particularly interested, would be quite helpful.
Well, one of the dangers of stakeholder engagement around this area and going back is that, so the usual suspects turn up, you get the positions from certain kind of interests, and that can, shape policy thinking. So it depends a bit on what you're expecting RPP2 to deliver. I mean, if to my mind, it's a benchmarking exercise about reporting on progress and sort of policy formation in the context of uncertainty. So it's not going to be an easy read. It's got to be a sort of a digest of quite detailed measures and how that adds up. I don't think that's going to do the job of selling this policy area, why we're doing it. And by the way, I would just like to say the Scottish Government should be applauded for its kind of ambitions in the broad around this, because what we've seen in Westminster is a kind of a fracturing of the consensus around this to some extent. So and we do a lot of work with Westminster, and it is quite striking how quickly the electricity decarbonisation target was set, and the kind of old party consensus around this has been quite encouraging in the longer term context. And those messages aren't going away. All the messages about longer term change and the pathways to get there haven't really changed. We haven't got the same levels of financial appetite for some of this in the shorter term, but the actual kind of this system needs transforming. We need to get to a point over the next decades where this is a highly transformed system and it looks quite different. How much of that we can take on over different time periods and so on is the question that we're sort of grappling with. I do think there is a lack of there's been a lack of engagement throughout several years now on this from kind of wider societal engagement. But I don't think RPP2 is the vehicle for doing that, probably. Okay. I think we're looking for more, let's make it easy for where is the evidence base, where are the benchmarks around progress from RPP1, the read across between the documents, and sort of short-term transparency and clarity of policy mechanisms and budgets, and then longer term from the treatment of the big kind of uncertainties post-2020 and how they're going to be, how policy delivery is resilient to those, the things that I've already mentioned.
Okay.
I would just say I wouldn't underestimate the huge amount of consultation and engagement there's been on the individual parts of the strategy, whether it's land use, waste, transport, electricity or heat. So I don't think we've got any concerns around the process of consultation on the actual document itself.
Right, thank you very much. It's been quite a long session and we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm very grateful to you for coming along. We'll have a short suspension to allow a changeover. for being a little bit behind the clock. Our second panel, looking at RPP2, starting from the left, we have Professor Sean Smith, Director of the Institute for Sustainable Construction at Napier University, Dr. Sam Gardner, who is the Senior Climate and Energy Policy Officer, WWF Scotland, and Richard Atkins from the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. Welcome to you all. Before we get into questions, does anybody want to say anything by way of a brief introduction? No, happy just to go straight into questions. Can I maybe just start off then picking up a theme that came through the previous session, which was very much about the lack of clarity in RPP2 about how exactly we'll meet the various climate change targets. Is that something you would agree with, or do you feel there's enough there in terms of clarity around actions and costs and who's responsible?
I think it's could be a very pertinent question. I think the one area where the RPP could be substantively improved to the benefit of all, both the Parliament and for external stakeholders, is in the transparency of the information that it sets out to allow for scrutiny of its implementation. And I'm quite conscious that it is very difficult to read between the two, RPP1 and RPP2. It's difficult to assess to what extent RPP2 is taking steps to account for the missed target in 2010. There's a statement, there's a few paragraphs on that, but very little detail about what specifically is going to be happening. And there is a combination of vague language at times around proposals and a lack of information that allows the reader to understand when certain things are going to happen. For instance, the National Retrofit Programme is introduced as a policy, but also as a proposal. But in the technical appendix, they're given slightly different names and they come in at different times. And it just doesn't help the reader understand what is expected to happen at a particular time, and you're left with questions. So I think there is significant improvements that could be made in the kind of transparency of the information in the RPP.
Okay. Sean.
I would agree. I think when I went through the document, I was comparing it with the previous RPP1 and reading other people's comments. Certainly there was that lack of sort of transition. Where were we? Where are we going? As a comparison. That said, the document and the ambitions which the government is trying to do should be encouraged in terms of it's a very difficult area to focus, given new technologies, given into some of the specific details, as some of the groups commented on earlier, and the external variations that happen out with the Scottish Government's control. What would have been useful is if there had been more scenario outlines of scenario A, B, C, short, medium, long, or risk, low risk, medium risk, which would at least given some weighting to allowing the viewpoints to be brought over the different sectors and different areas that are there in the Scottish Government document. One thing where it would have been extremely useful is to maybe have some example case studies. So if you're talking about homes and communities, if you're talking about an element of a housing stock or a group of types of buildings or commercial stock, for example, and to have had before and after data. And it was something which the 2020 Built Environment Group, which I serve on, raised some time ago in the subcommittee meetings, that as part of the message of engaging with the general public or with businesses or across the public sector, we have to ensure that we are providing the information which is helpful to them. And what we see is the mention of the Inverness Expo, which is in this document, with prediction savings of £100 a year. Now, the Expo was finished some years ago. Did we need predictions, or could they have shown us the real data? So there were small things, but they build up, which then creates this sort of lack of clarity, and then the comparison between the two documents.
I think actually building on Sean's point to a large extent, and obviously where we're coming from in terms of the RIS is predominantly in terms of the built environment, and the big issue we have is the existing built environment, which is we're not replacing that or refurbishing that at anything like the rate we need to. I think part of the problem we have is when you look at an overarching document like RPP2, as soon as you drill down from the aspirations and the policies into the technical details, it becomes enormously complex. Buildings are incredibly subtle things in terms of how they work, how energy is used in them. We have a whole different range of building types. We have a range of different assessment methodologies which do subtly different and sometimes quite weird things. We have a whole range of different operational impacts from users, and we have a culture which lacks a focus, generally speaking, on optimizing the performance of the existing built assets. So it's the technical issues are on one level quite easy to understand and well understood, but they layer up together to create a very complex picture, which policy is by definition struggles to deal with.
Can I just pick up that last point, Richard, about buildings, because the written submission we got from the SCDI about some of the costs of this points out that the total cost of moving all commercial property in Scotland towards meeting the required standards is going to be £12.5 billion. And as they point out, 97% of the non-domestic built environment is owned or occupied by SMEs. How on earth are we going to find the money, or how on earth are these businesses going to find the money to meet these requirements?
I think it's a huge question when you start looking at building costs and looking at the trigger points for refurbishment and improvement. If you're looking at an intervention that is dictated by improving the energy efficiency of a building, then it's difficult to make that cost effective. If you are looking at the consequential improvement of improving the energy efficiency when you're doing something else to a building because it's driven by a change in business or demographics or even a replacement of a building, it actually becomes much more cost effective. At the moment in the current regulations, we have very few triggers for those consequential improvements. The building standards have moved a very long way to making new buildings far more efficient than they were even a few years ago. But of course, the vast majority of new building that we're building is on top of the plimsoll line. There's actually a relatively little rate of replacement. And again, we have a financial culture where everyone assumes a building is of quite high financial value. Even if it's a tumbly down shed in a corner somewhere, building owners think at some point this is my pension, and we've got to find a mechanism that recognises that over time buildings become less valuable unless they are improved, and we need to have regulations that say, well, when you're going to change something, you need to go from being the worst to being the best, because that will have a payback period in probably 10-12 years of the extra overcost.
Okay, so it's about incrementally trying to improve rather than trying to do it as a big leap.
Well, incrementally across, in terms of the stock, the problem that you have is for very understandable reasons, I think legislation and regulation are driving towards small incremental improvements across all the stock. So make it a bit better and a bit better again, a bit better again. And that's not cost effective. It's very difficult then to say, well, how do you accept that you almost have a mechanism to ration improvement, to say you don't need to refurbish this building for a variety of reasons yet, but when you do it in, say, 10, 20 years, spend the extra over cash and do it extremely well, because the cost, as I say, the cost effectiveness of the extra over cost does stack up financially.
Right, but we're expecting businesses to have that cash at that time to do that improvement.
Well, I think there's the point that Norman brought up in the last panel. For a very high proportion of the built stock out there, the person paying the fuel bill is not the person who owns the building. And that fuel bill, whilst fuel is going up and energy is expensive, for probably most businesses is a relatively small cost against the rest of their business. And their concern is more likely how do we ensure our business is profitable, and how do we make sure we have continuity of business. So if you say to them, can you close your factory for a week while we insulate it, and that will pay back over 15 years, yeah, not a chance.
Yeah. Sorry, Sean, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I would agree, and I'm very pleased you brought the non-domestic sector. The commercial sector within the document was covered, and it outlined the expenditure the Scottish Government was going to provide or support into the public and, it said, public and commercial type buildings, which was a small amount. But we certainly feel the SME sector is a critical area that would need more support. And again, benchmark data to help SMEs. You think how many hairdressing salons there are out there, bakeries, etc. There's no centralised point where people can benchmark how are we doing versus other, typical business sectors. And that would really help. And as you say, it's 99.3% of all private sector businesses in Scotland, 55% private sector employment. I mean, it's the SME, or sort of small size enterprises, are very important. But one thing I'd just like to touch on, if I may, in terms of the economic downturn, as a result of the economic downturn and sadly the redundancies, one of the positives has been the new establishment of new businesses where people, instead of becoming unemployed, have decided to establish their own business and invest. And of the 30,800 new businesses that were formed between 2011 and 2012 in Scotland, 25,000 were micro businesses. That's a staggering number. Now, many of these businesses will either work from home or work from small premises. And there are some easy wins if we could help this sector in terms of how we reduce their emissions without actually touching the building fabric. And part of that is through building occupant behaviour. Now, you may have heard of the Scottish company UGECO, or TECO, that owns UGECO. UGECO is EWGECO. It's electricity, water, gas, eco kind of monitor. It's a real-time display. Now, there's been quite a lot of studies going on. Edinburgh Napier's been involved with many of these. And we just recently, for the committee's interest today, got some of the commercial and public sector data on studies which have been coming in. And to give you an example, if you take 7 of the businesses that were involved in these studies, all based around Perth, from B&Bs, a nursing home, an accountancy company, a small office, a small industrial building, and a business park, the savings across those, just by people being able to monitor their energy costs, was 41,000 over 7 very small businesses. The average payback was 4.5 months. Now, they've not touched the fabric. They've just understood exactly in real time how they are using their energy within the building. Now, if you ratchet that up, there are 330,000 SMEs across Scotland. If 1 in 10 of those, for every 1 in 10, you can actually generate an apprentice job, at least, maybe even 2 apprentice jobs, or they can start to invest in their fabric of the building by the savings that they make themselves. The occupant behaviour within the RPP2, leading from the non-domestic into RPP2 elements here, is that within the RPP2, the behavioural change, these are not cited as resources, as in real-time displays. Smart meters are referred to, but smart meters buried in a cupboard under the stair does not tell the occupant of that building how they're using their energy. So can we please clarify that smart meters does not equal occupant behaviour? The smart meter has to be linked to a real-time display. And the next thing we would suggest is that we actually need to energy rate the real-time displays. Many utility companies give these away for free just now. The average annual running cost of some of these could be up to £80 a year. The best and most efficient system, which is a Scottish-based company that manufactures this, is £4 a year. But they're investing in the technology to make sure it's only £4 a year. But we don't energy rate the real-time displays that monitor your energy. So
you're surely not suggesting that energy companies cynically are giving these away to customers knowing that they will cost them more on their energy bills?
I'm just saying that the company that is actually charging effectively is the lowest running cost of a device. The reason is that they have invested in higher technology components to ensure it's only £4 a year as opposed to 40, 50 or £80 a year.
Interesting. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Right, I'll bring Sam. Do you want to say anything about this? Or? No, that's fine. Okay, I'll bring in Rhoda Grant next.
Thank you. The same question as I'd asked the previous panel. What policies, proposals do you feel are missing from RPP2?
Kick off. I think the first thing to say is that we find that the RPP2 is over-reliant on proposals. And so as it stands, the only way that we'll hit our 2020 target is in the very final scenario that's set out in the RPP, which is where the EU moves its target to 30%, all the proposals are delivered and all the policies are delivered, and all those policies deliver to the fullness of their expected emissions abatement. So currently there's a huge reliance on proposals which, as they're defined in here, may or may not happen some way down the line. There is a need to shift some of those proposals into a status of policy, and there, for instance, the minimum standards, the introduction of minimum standards in the private housing market is one such area which has come a long way in its development, and it's good to see it acknowledged in here, but we feel it could be given greater certainty, and its time of introduction could be brought forward to reflect the urgency, but also to match it better with the Green Deal and with ECO, in order that the two work in combination, the regulation and the incentive, so that we actually do drive the uptake. So that's one specific example. I think transport, I know the ICI committee, but if you would just allow me to say one thing, particularly on transport, which is that at the moment there isn't a single policy in the RPP on the transport sector that the Scottish Government recognises is delivering sufficient effort to contribute to the targets. So we're all aware that there is work going on within the transport sector. There's support for cycling and walking, albeit not sufficient support. But the RPP acknowledges that that work currently isn't at a level to warrant it getting the kind of status of policy. So we currently don't have a single policy operating on the transport sector to deliver the emissions abatement. But we do have lots of proposals. And we know what we're delivering those. We know how to do them. We have them kind of being rolled out. All that's missing is sufficient support to get them into a status that will deliver the emissions abatement. So the transport sector in particular is ripe for movement from proposal into a policy status. On renewable heat, which we may come to later, and I know the previous group spoke about, the District Heating Expert Commission has brought forward a package of measures of 18 recommendations. And I think it would have been very welcome if some of those had found their way into the RPP, because they would have been allowed the scrutiny of the Parliament, they would have been given proper consideration, and they would have been given the certainty that the RPP, I think, affords them. So there are, specifically on district heating, I think there are those examples which could have been in the RPP, which would go some way to improve it quite significantly.
I think I touched on earlier some of the elements and maybe some examples I would have liked to have seen that would have just maybe supported some of the information that was being given in the document. If I could draw the committee's attention, I don't have it in front of you, but page 163, myself and my colleagues at the Institute, I also have the Scottish Energy Centre team within the Institute. We went through the document. It's not often that everyone around the table suddenly gasps when they look at something. And it was a gasp of surprise on page 163, which is basically the homes and communities, the policies and proposals, and the element. And I think generally we could understand everything that was being put there, except for one. And I know this has been brought up in some of the written submissions, which is the additional technical potential in fabric and energy efficiency, which very kindly the SPICE organisation in Scottish Parliament have graphed up for everybody, because it wasn't presented as a graph within the document. Looking at this graph, these are all the sort of typical measures and other things and policies, understandable, which we're all focusing on just now and which will carry on over a period of time. But those two lines there, and particularly this one, represents the additional technical potential. So somewhere out there, there is a wonder product or series of wonder products which is going to deliver this staggering reduction in emissions abatement. Now, of course, as soon as any academic reads that, they want to burrow down and get the detail. And this is going to be published apparently in the RPP3. I think from what's in, or what maybe shouldn't have been in, was I think it would have been better if that had not been in, because it's raised a whole lot of questions to people as what technologies, what additional fabric improvements over and above. I mean, this is going to supersede the National Retrofit Programme, it's going to supersede the Green Deal and ECO in terms of its emission reductions and fabric efficiency through technologies. And we're working with various universities just now, particularly through the BRE Trust Fellows, which brings 12 universities together, Cambridge, Napier, Edinburgh, Strathclyde, to work in this specific area and to meet regularly. We know that Cambridge has developed some new devices which will come on the market shortly, which will be manufactured in the UK, that will dramatically improve lighting over and above LEDs. We know there's some other technologies happening, but there's nothing that we've seen in our radar that's going to match this. If I can then cross-reference That then led us to, well, someone must have got this information from somewhere, but it's not referenced. So then we found, of course, the Climate Change Committee's document, Chapter 5, which starts to talk about the reduction emissions and talks about the 2030 improvements. And then figure 5.12 is a graph which shows in 2030 there'll be this staggering, or over 2020, 2030, this staggering reduction in emissions. If you then cross-reference what is this new technology which is going to deliver this, it will be in residential, and it will be air source heat pumps. Now, we've got some good experts at Edinburgh Napier, and no one has yet seen a technology that's going to deliver this. And given that we have 40% flats in Scotland and there's only 18% in England for flats, and the mix of our stock and where we are, again, we question. It's useful to intimate in the document or a policy or a strategy, this is what we're intending to do, and provide some information. But having placed that graph in there, it kind of, if you withdraw that line, then we wouldn't meet the 2030 targets by any means, or even come close.
So this is all climate now?
Well, we need more detail, coming to the previous panel and this panel's view.
Which is shorthand for yes.
More detail would be useful.
Okay. Rhoda?
I don't know how to respond to that. I think a wing and a prayer was a phrase I used at the last panel. I think you've kind of said there's no wing and there's no prayer.
May I just add one thing? I think in any policy for any government, it's incredibly important to set a sort of strategy and a direction and ambition. Without ambition, without the Code for Sustainable Homes, without Section 7 sustainability in Scotland, we wouldn't be doing the innovation we're doing now. So I don't want to take anything away from the document itself of this is where we're trying to get to. I think, coming back to it, it's the detail.
Can I just, a quick supplementary on that, but given that our targets are set out in legislation, I mean, this isn't ambition, this isn't about, you know, everyone of course is ambitious to cut carbon targets. What we have is a legal obligation to do so. And if what you're saying is that the main building block for reaching that target actually doesn't exist and nobody knows what it could be, is there a chance that we will reach our legal obligations?
I think whether it's new technologies as whether it's some other measures, it will be difficult. And I was asked the last time when I was here about a year ago at the EET, where the very last question was, it was a yes or no to the committee, will we hit the target? And I was there with a built environment hat on, and maybe we can get into Green Deal shortly. And my concern was, you know, was it a slow car crash waiting to happen? It wasn't in terms of the carbon target, etc. It was more the issues of some of the nuts and bolts that come together to make that get there. So I don't regard this as a slow car crash, just to refine that. But I think in terms of some of the elements here, this is going to be a real challenge. It's going to be very difficult. And the one sector, is offshore renewables and onshore renewables, which really could deliver for us. And I'm encouraged by the progress that's been made in the renewable sector to date.
I just wanted to touch on this because I think it reflects on the balance of contribution that's expected from different sectors. And so the expectation that's been placed on the Homes and Communities chapter and there is significant, and you can see that this line of hope for abatement has been introduced without an awful lot of evidence to support it. But in doing so, it relieves a pressure from some other sector within the RPP. And as I touched on earlier, we see a modest level of ambition for the transport sector, and that's afforded by this hoped for abatement from the Homes and Community sector. So it's not to say in any means that we can't hit our targets. It's about we have to look at the whole economy in the round and make sure that every part is playing it's making its full contribution to doing so, and we're not putting some unreasonable expectation on some hoped for product that will deliver abatement to the home sector that no one actually at the moment is able to put their finger on. By just touching on this debate about abatement that's expected to kick in from 2025 and 2023, certainly beyond the 2020 target, and contrasting that with the level of ambition that we're seeing in the coming years, I think it's quite stark that you can look at the figures, which I have to commend the Scottish Government on presenting this level of information, which we don't see in Westminster documents, but this is still a level of transparency that's very encouraging. I think it could go further, but it is in itself very helpful, and it allows the reader to see that the balance of effort falls, in many instances, the other side of 2020. That's particularly stark in the transport sector. It's there also in land use, and it's there for the home sector as well. And I think that puts us in a position where we're placing an awful lot of reliance on a period that we have a great deal of uncertainty about. WWF has always acknowledged that the RPP was going to be challenged in providing specific prescriptions for 2027. That's too far away to offer that same level of accuracy. But therefore, don't put such a huge reliance on our meeting our targets on that period in the future, and instead build in some immediate action now, and whether that be on, for instance, bringing forward the proposed introduction of minimum standards to 2015, making sure that we don't roll back on our new build standards for homes and the non-domestic buildings. Both examples of where we can see a little bit of urgency that would deliver abatement now that wouldn't put this reliance on future where there's a great deal of uncertainty.
If I can pick up on those points as well, I think the built environment does have the potential to deliver this level of energy demand reduction. But not in the timescales that are perhaps suggested, certainly not in the current fiscal regulatory climate that we have. And as Sean says, there's no magic bullet. There isn't a piece of technology out there that's going to come off a shelf and do this. We've got to do everything in a sense. We in the RIS have a real concern that a lot of initiatives are being brought forward which are fundamental design interventions into the built environment, and those have, as I said right at the beginning, have all sorts of consequences within a building. The headline might be saving energy, but they can cause other problems, and they don't, or exasperate other problems. And a lot of the initiatives that are coming forward at the moment don't provide the depth of understanding to perhaps potentially see all of those issues. I mean, I think in summary, yes, the built environment can deliver a lot of this stuff, but you're probably looking at a 25, 30, 40-year program, not a short-term program, because it comes back to this, what is driving the intervention.
Can I ask another question on a different subject? Just
Mike, you want to come in on this, or do you want to just let Rhoda ask her question and then come in afterwards?
I'm interested, you know, in the heat pump angle, if you don't mind.
As long as I can.
Yeah, as long as I'll bring you back in.
Rhoda, I'll give you an air source heat pump free of charge if you like. It's got a minor technical problem that
it doesn't work.
All efforts to fix it, but it's otherwise brand new. And and it had a price tag of about 6k. I'm still smarting about that. It's interesting, but you know. One of the things, surely what you've identified as one of the problems here, one of the reasons that the document resists the kind of level of detail that you've been able to drill down into. But surely, you know, if we're going to solve this problem, and I don't think it's disingenuous to say that we'll do it through by means of better technology or greater uptake of technology. You mentioned the case of the savings for business, just through being able to utilise technology to monitor their energy usage. So, you know, but the problem is, you know, and sometimes my concern is that we get into a situation where the political bun fight that we have actually doesn't help us at all. It actually serves to detract from what we all the direction that we'd like to go in. But I mean, you know, so the question I'll come to the point though. Yes, but don't you think we could solve the problem right now? Put a wee 3-4 kilowatt wind turbine on every single house in Scotland next year.
No.
That would achieve the demand reduction that we're talking about.
Yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head, demand reduction. And those savings, I mean, I talked about earlier on, the average was 18%. The accountancy firm, believe it or not, was a 52% saving. Now, you would think accountancy firms would be wanting to be more careful about how they spend their money, but I think it's an example of what we're missing but the data, yes, and it's demand-side management and demand reduction.
If I can come in on that, because it's exactly the same point I was going to make, and before the meeting I sketched down some of the reasons, some of the current impediments that why that doesn't happen at the moment. And there are 3 or 4 very simple things. One, in terms of control systems. Control systems for new buildings have come down astonishingly in cost. No longer do they need to be hardwired. The ability to put in a proper control package for a building is much, much more affordable. Very seldom happens in an existing building unless you're doing a retrofit. We have a huge problem across the UK in the industry in terms of how buildings and services are commissioned. The commissioning process, and I was talking to a friend of mine who manages 60, 70 buildings, and they used to manage a building that I was involved in, and I naively asked them, well, we had a few commissioning problems. This is going back 10, 15 years ago, and I naively asked them, and I presume the commissioning process has got better, expecting the answer, yes, it has. The answer was, no, it's got worse. The commissioning process for buildings tends to be a checking process that the sensors work, as in their sensing, and the control systems work in a, it can be made to do stuff. But then it's just left. It's left in some sort of, not random setup mode, but a setup mode where the heating engineer and the installer knows the client won't be cold. What then doesn't tend to happen on the vast majority of buildings is you have someone who's actually responsible for running that control system and adjusting it, and has been given the knowledge and the training and the ability to do it. Most buildings, the small buildings or even medium-sized buildings that Sean's talking about, someone will have been left with the instruction booklet, and they've told, there's the time clock, and they've gone, well, I'm not going to touch that. Because if I turn the boiler off, or I put the boiler to come on an hour later at 8 o'clock instead of 7 o'clock, and the boss turns up and he's cold, whose fault's it going to be? I'll just leave it alone, it's working. And that's why you could take 10, 20% out of the off the energy bill of probably the majority of buildings. Very few buildings, you know, the Parliament I would expect to be an exception. It's big enough to have a team looking at these things. Most buildings don't.
And in a way, you've kind of answered the question, though. Surely that is one of the potential, you know, the intelligent building, the intelligent house.
Yeah.
Is one potential solution that we haven't really scratched the surface on yet.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, the technology is not, it's not rocket science. Mm-hmm. It's actually with us, we've just not taken it up.
Sure.
Yeah, just to clarify, the buildings that we looked at here, all we're doing is displaying the information. So the company nominated someone to be an energy champion, and they see the display, and they can walk around the office or whatever with it, or it can sit on the wall and people can see it, and it has flashing lights, traffic light systems. So, but coming to the very important point you mentioned is the energy management side, beyond on controls and other things, which is different to this. These savings average 18%. We're done without any additional controls. It's just a device that's telling you how much energy you're utilising. Yes, there's a skills upgrade there, there's a knowledge, then there's sort of the legacy. If someone leaves, does someone then pick that up? Who's responsible for that as it goes through? But there are a lot of, I agree, a lot of new technologies and reductions in energy usage through control systems on their way. And we understand there are a couple of companies actually looking to invest in setting up businesses in Scotland, which will be great for employment because of some of the skills base we have here. For the UK market in this particular area. So it's not really touched on within the RPP2. To be fair to the point before, how much detail can you go down to? You know, there's elements, but if you put something in, you've got to provide at least some evidence. Otherwise, don't put it in, because people will then ask the questions. And
right, Sam, want to come in?
Just to follow up on this discussion, particularly about evidence, and a striking absence that we see in the RPP that I think would go a long way to, if it was addressed, to provide greater confidence in the abatement that's projected, is a more rigorous evaluation and monitoring programme that actually presents a description, a real empirical description of the efficacy of the policies that we're committed to. Are they delivering the emissions that have been attributed to them? Are they likely to deliver the ones that they're projected to do in the future? And it's a noticeable absence from the RPP. There's something called the Emissions Reduction Board, which has its minutes published on the Scottish Government website, but it doesn't give you an awfully strong insight into how this assessment is happening. And I think it's critical that I think we'd all accept that this has to be something of a live document, and things will change, policies will be more or less effective than where they were perhaps predicted to be, but we'll only have that information and be able to flex our kind of effectiveness if we have that assessment of what's working and what's not working, and that's a key aspect I think that's missing.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
and
fine.
I mean, I could make one final point, you know, but I won't do it.
Right, Rhoda, back to you.
Thank you. Can I come back to Sam Gardner, just looking at the submission from WWF? You're probably aware we're also looking at the Energy Bill legislative consent motion, and you talk about the Scottish Government handing back the emissions performance standards to the UK Government and where they're set. What impact will this have in reaching our carbon reduction targets?
Well, there's a very interesting chapter in the RPP, and indeed its own little box. I could find the page, but I'm sure you've all seen it. But there's a bit there which talks about the introduction of CCS and the expected rollout of carbon capture and storage. That expectation has to be contrasted with the likely introduction of a UK emissions performance standard of 450 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. That doesn't impact on a new build gas power station whatsoever. You could build that gas power station, and according to the UK Energy Bill as it currently is, that would be able to operate completely unabated until 2045. So we have a UK Energy Bill going through that's likely to sanction the building of new gas-fired power stations, which there will be a need for across the UK in small numbers and function in a particular way. But for Scotland, we have a very welcome specific target to 50 grams of carbon intensity by 2030, but then a contradictory position in support of an EPS of 450 grams. And the the RPP makes some statements about the expected rollout of carbon capture and storage by 2025, and then a step change again in 2027. But in the absence of any indication as to how that's going to be compelled or why it would happen, why would a power generator, a company operating a gas-fired power station in Scotland, fit CCS if there's no emissions performance standard to require it to happen? So there may well be measures that the Scottish Government are able to introduce that in effect work alongside the EPS or supersede it through planning controls or through planning consents. And we would hope to see some statements from the Scottish Government, from ministers, that lend confidence to this aspiration of CCS rollout, because at the moment it seems hopeful at best, and it's fundamental, because if we don't achieve that decarbonisation of our power sector by 2030, our projected emissions reductions in our heat and in our transport sector from the rollout of electric vehicles or air source heat pumps are significantly undermined. So this little box that's there in the early section of the energy bit, which talks about the rollout of CCS, if that doesn't happen and we have new gas-fired power stations on the grid, we're really locking ourselves into some high carbon infrastructure that prevents us from hitting our targets in the future.
Okay, so would there be a benefit in us having a different emissions target than the rest of the UK, or is there another way that we would mitigate against or try and bring in CCS?
I think in the first instance it would be great if the UK, and I know there are amendments to this effect in the Energy Bill at the moment, pursued an EPS that was fit for a decarbonised power sector by 2030 that followed the advice of the UK Committee on Climate Change. But in the absence of that, and the Scottish Government has previously said very clearly that it thinks an EPS should incentivise CCS, which this one won't do, so it'll do nothing to support the development of CCS. It should impact on gas and coal to ensure that we reduce our emissions from those, and it should be in line with the 2030 decarb target. And so the onus is on the Scottish Government, given its very welcome commitment to a decarbonised power sector, to make some statements as to how it intends to achieve that in the context of a UK EPS that doesn't support it.
Thank you.
Alison Johnson.
Just maybe a bit more clarity on that. You obviously don't agree that a Scottish EPS is the only tool that can help here. So what do we need to push the government to do now? the Scottish Government?
Well, in the first instance, it would be good to get some clarity as to whether or not the Scottish Government is able to set an emissions performance standard. I think it's a little bit blurred. There was a debate during the passage of the Climate Change Bill about the introduction of an emissions performance standard, and at the time there was a suggestion that it wasn't within the Scottish Parliament's gift to set a legislative EPS, but there may well be measures that we could take through planning guidance, through planning regulations. So at the moment we have a statement for coal, which is that any new coal-fired power station that's built in Scotland has to have 300 megawatts of CCS from the outset. That only applies to coal, and then a gas-fired power station just has to be CCR, so carbon capture ready, which typically means that you have to have a car park to one side that you can then hope to build your carbon capture unit on, which is clearly not adequate. So there could be a similar statement, policy statement, for placing a similar requirement on gas that sets out the trajectory of CCS rollout from the word go and increasingly increases the contribution of CCS to that power station over its lifetime. It's not about 100% CCS from the outset, but it is about reducing the emissions from coal and gas-fired power stations so that they hit a 2030 decarbonised power sector target.
Okay, thank you. Can I, on another topic, given that we missed the climate change target in 2010 and concerns from various groups, I mean, our own Parliament Research Centre here have said that that the RPP2, it only includes 5 paragraphs in that large document on the missed target, that there's no detail on what policies or proposals have changed to respond to the missed target. Do you feel that there's an increased ambition in RPP2 that you would have expected to see? I'd like to ask all panel members that question.
I'm happy for someone else to go first.
No, I think taking the economic situation just now, let's take the new build sector as an example. Recently, the government's just announced the Section 6 energy consultation requirements on new build housing. I think the aspiration had been to go for 60%, as developed by the Sullivan Committee some time ago, and it looks like it will go at 45%. Part of it is a balance of trying to measure where are we in the economy and what can we achieve in this period just now. So I wouldn't expect them to try at this stage to recover that just now, a missed element. And you know, some of the trajectory actually wasn't bad. I mean, it's, you know, we can't fault them on all of those years. No, there's just an element to it. So I would, going forward, we look at what England's doing. They're going to have an 8% improvement on their energy new build, whereas Scotland will have 45%. Similar companies operating north and south of the border. So I think, given the measures of the economic situation, using that as an example, I think it's a balanced view. And maybe as technologies develop, as further information and case studies come in, maybe in 3 years, RPP3 or the one after that, there's an element to then re-review, actually, could we do better?
I think, again, slightly picking up on Sean's point, and I have to declare an interest as I sat on the working group for the revisions to Section 6. And those were debated long and hard in terms of what the appropriate next step of the regulations would be. And it's probably no surprise that certainly as RIS, our line was that we should be sticking with the target set down by Sullivan. But there were strong arguments for industry, as Sean's outlined. What I, as I mentioned before, would like to have seen within Section 6 was a strengthening of the consequential improvements that would start to deal with the existing building stock, which is where the vast majority of energy use already lies. And I would also throw a sort of cautionary note that the targets that are set are based on a specific methodology, whether that's the standard assessment procedure for domestic or the simplified building energy modelling or even dynamic simulation for non-domestic. And those methodologies need to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, in that they obviously do show, they demonstrate a trend. You can see by assessing building A against an improved building B, it will be better. How closely they actually reflect the energy performance of those buildings is dependent on a number of criteria. Firstly, the calibration within those methodologies, but secondly, the operational use of those buildings. And one of the things that we are still lacking in Scotland is the introduction of display energy certificates, which would give for buildings not just the theoretical, this is how it should perform, but this how it does perform. You know, it's another piece of information like smart metering that actually gives the people running the building some information and the ability to say, well, if we're using that amount of energy, is it because we're actually open 24 hours a day and not the 8 hours that's assumed, or is it because we've got the heating on and the windows open? You know, and you need those sort of pieces of information for someone to question: have we optimised this building?
Specifically on whether or not WWF feels that the RPP2 reflects an increased ambition in light of the fact that we missed the 2010 target, the answer would be no. RPP2 was an awful long time in development, and there's good reason for that. It's a substantive document, and it's a big effort to collate this information from across government. But it doesn't, as far as we can see, reflect either the advice of the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is calling for a step change in ambition, or the introduction of additional policy effort, which you can see in communications from the UK Committee on Climate Change to the Scottish Government. And what's concerning is that with regards to the missed target, there's a statement that's to the effect of we will make up for this shortfall over the duration of this period, which either means that we continue to miss targets until such a time that we've made up that shortfall, or we're reliant on exogenous kind of things changing our emissions abatement to ensure that we do hit the targets, like future mild winters, which will ensure that our emissions from the power sector aren't so significant, and therefore we can be confident that 2011 and 2012 we're likely to hit those targets. So there's a real concern that the failure to hit the very first target hasn't manifested itself in a step change in effort. And unfortunately, what we can see is perhaps the reverse. So there was milestones in RPP1, and it's unfortunate in many cases those milestones have been removed from RPP2, and I would urge the committee to recommend that they be reinstated, because they offer a very clear way of monitoring its implementation. It's not about numbers of carbon emissions reduction, it's about installation of lofts, cavities, provision of renewable heat technologies. So for instance, there was one that said 100,000 homes would have renewable heat technologies by 2020. If you look in the technical annex now for this, I don't suggest you do, it's there, it says 20,000 homes would have renewable heat technologies by the same date. And similarly, with the rolling back of the proposed new build standards, that would suggest to us a reduction in ambition and a lack of a sense of urgency, which sends a poor signal to the market. It reduces our emissions reduction, and it puts the onus elsewhere, and does nothing to help really kind of give that signal that we build a supply chain, invest in the technologies, and the construction industry is given a signal of certainty that this is the trajectory that we're set on. So there is a concerning picture with regards to the absence of any urgency and step change in ambition.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one more question, Kavina? The earlier panel this morning and witnesses we've heard from previously have raised concerns about disaggregation of information. RPP2 features only 5 budget line proposals. There were 13 in RPP1, and it does make it challenging to compare and contrast. How important is it that you think, obviously there will be changes from year to year, but how important is it that we have a standardised, easily accessible document that we all get used to, because this is going to come back year after year? And what impact do you think that lack of clarity will have on the targets? I mean, only the 2013 target is met with proposals. Do you think that's something that we need to build in? Is milestones, I know you picked up on that in your earlier response, but do you think that's essential to meeting the targets at the end of the day?
I think milestones are a very important factor in helping guide committees such as these and the wider interested stakeholder community as to how things are being implemented, provide some direction of travel, provide certainty to those industries that there's an expectation on them to play a particular role. So I think they're very important. I do think it is important that we get this final RPP provides as clear a presentation of information as possible, because this will be the document that will be referred to, and the future budgets and spending reviews will be held against, and the comparisons have to be as easy as possible. It's a very challenging exercise to compare a budget to the RPP, having tried to do it, and this one doesn't help matters, I think, because whilst it's still a good effort, the fact that it has gone backwards in part from RPP1 by aggregating information, by capturing a number of different proposals, say, for instance, sustainable communities in the transport sector brings together a whole suite of proposals that were set out disaggregated in the RPP1, and they in themselves are different budget lines come the budget. So it gets harder and harder to kind of judge to what extent the RPP is being funded to the tune that it describes as necessary. So I think it is very important that we have transparency in the presentation of information.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to pick up on that?
I would just agree with that. It would be very useful, much more useful, particularly from a policy perspective, or expenditure budget moving forward, as you mentioned, the cross-reference.
Thank you. Good afternoon. In the WWF, Sam's report said we believe a step change is needed to improve the energy efficiency of our housing stock. And do you believe that RPP2 falls short of reflecting the step change? I spoke at the opening of a conference called ZEMCH, Zero Energy Mass Customisation Housing, and there was a presentation here by Professor Ari Friedman about zero energy houses, one of which he has built in the grounds of McGill University. I just wonder if you have any comment as to whether or not we're progressing along that line quickly enough, notwithstanding the sustainable housing strategy and the retrofit programme. Have you any views as to, from your knowledge, as to how we're progressing in terms of this type of housing, which is modular based, which you could actually buy from the equivalent of a B&Q for something like 80,000 Canadian dollars?
I'm sure these technical experts will be able to speak much more confidently and accurately about the extent to which we are realising the opportunities of new build technologies and fully kind of supporting those. I would just flag, though, that it's WWF's view that the reduction in the new build standards for the domestic sector provides the perverse signal to that very industry that their products and the homes that they're able to sell are not being, and not part of the immediate vision of the Scottish Government when it comes to new build. So we would really encourage the Scottish Government to, in its consultation on the new build standards, to stick with the Sullivan recommendations, because one, if we don't, we're locking in a retrofit demand for further down the years, which is going to be far more expensive than building those in the first instance. And secondly, the signal that it provides is a strong signal to supply chains, to mass, to kind of bulk purchasing and bulk construction that will go a long way to actually reducing some of those initial additional construction costs. So I think there's a strong signal that would be sent by sticking to the Sullivan recommendations, and obviously an equally strong signal that will come through if they get eroded, which is what's currently proposed.
Yeah, just building on, I was at the same conference and I remember the presentation as well. From a technical point of view, there's no reason why the industry can't belly up to the bar, as it were, in terms of new build housing. But to put it into context, if you look at the current demolition rate of existing dwellings in, I think, mid-2010, 2011, it was about 4,500 in Scotland. Replacement of the whole housing stock would take 540 years at that pace, and vast majority of that is historic stuff which, for very good cultural reasons, we wouldn't want to be replacing. And I think what I'm trying to emphasise, I suppose, is not just the scale of the task and the fact that the majority of new build is, as I say, on top of that plimsoll line, is also to think about what are the barriers to the industry doing it at the moment. One is the regulations don't require zero energy, and as we've talked about, it doesn't look like they're even going to require the next step change in the Sullivan report. But the construction industry is incredibly risk averse. You're dealing with even when you've got quite large contractors out there is actually still a very fragmented industry, building relatively small amounts of small product in small locations where the market is dictated very much by existing house prices or existing property prices. And that drives the economics of the construction sector, where they've got a sort of fixed value at the end of it. And the way development economics works is that that value gets washed out until you get to a land value. So there's very little free play within that calculation, in that process, to start looking at methods and technologies that are going to increase cost, start looking at methodologies and technologies that might put off the buyer, or more importantly, put off the estate agent or the property valuer, and there's no regulations driving it, and there's very little incentive in terms of driving down the energy cost to the developer or the house builder. So there's all these. I'm sorry to sit here and say that because I'm a naturally optimistic person, but all you see as an architect is the barriers that stop making it happen in the way that technically we know it could.
Well, I declare an interest because we run the Low Carbon Building Technologies Gateway, which is sponsored by Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Funding Council and ERDF. We've been running it for 3 years. We've now supported over 290 different products from Scottish SMEs in the supply chain into low carbon housing, from external walls to insulation, new technologies, renewables, in terms of assessing them, helping the companies bring the products to market, or doing some of the early R&D. I think we have to be very careful about how we compare with the Sullivan Report, because the Sullivan Report is based on an assessment of an X percentage of reduction. And there are 7 different definitions of zero carbon, but the one which everybody pays attention to is the Treasuries, because that's the one that affects the stamp duty on the property of the house when it's sold. If we compare the energy costs of the 1990 buildings, or just before, or let's clarify that. The average energy cost in Scotland is £1,400 dual fuel bills. The energy cost of the new housing we currently build, which is not zero carbon, is £200 to £300. Some of them are less than that. So you've already hit a 70% reduction based primarily on energy consumption happening in the property, which is the main focus of what the zero carbon said. It's not zero carbon by material, it is zero carbon by the energy usage. So the house builders, if you're producing 3,500 homes a year, which CCG could in Glasgow, or Stuart Milne could do in Aberdeen, if you're putting in a new technology which you have not tried and tested, because someone's saying we need to go to zero carbon earlier, or we need to do X based on an assessment methodology that Sullivan looked at in terms of a 60% reduction, where that assessment methodology has actually been proven to be incorrect, we should come to Green Deal, because that's where it all started, the information came from. The issue is, if something goes wrong, and you've put in a new technology, and that's 3,000 homes, and it's £10,000 to repair, that's a huge risk. So the industry is understandably risk averse, but can I just say, some of the best technologies that are happening in this area just now are happening in Scotland and with UK partners. And some of the architects involved in this, from Gogai Devici, Robert Gordon University and others, fantastic. So let's not do down the industry, and let's not do down what we're currently doing. We will hit the Sullivan Report, but actually indirectly, and we will do this on the post-occupancy evaluation, which will no doubt follow in 2014, 2015, on what we build. But it comes back to, we don't have enough case study information on full-scale buildings. In September, the support statistic, in September 2009, at the close of play before the change in regulations in the United Kingdom in October 2010, 175,000 new homes were registered under the old building regulations. So we are not going to really start to see this flow of activity happening in new build to the numbers that we want to get the data, certainly not in the short term. The key answer and the solution will be with the RSLs and the housing associations who didn't register their properties then, who will build under the new standards, who are doing the fantastic post-occupancy evaluation like Kingdom Housing Association with the Housing Innovation Showcase. So that data will come forward. But we've got to get down into the nuts and bolts of one of the things that wasn't mentioned here is it's the what ifs. What if the Green Deal? What are the blockages? How as a policy or a strategy into RPP2, do we bring ECO and RPP2, Green Deal forward, which was touched on earlier by one of the members?
Well, that's very helpful. I must admit, I was kind of afraid when you said that you would build X number of houses, 100 houses, without being fully risk averse, and that somebody might have to go back and look at the implications of that cost. It certainly wouldn't happen, I don't think, in any other industry where you without going through the alpha test or beta test of a new product, without being sure that what you're going to put in place is absolutely correct. But just in terms of Sean, you mentioned the hurdles, and I don't know, Convener, whether this transgresses upon another committee, but how yeah, I'm sure you will. How au fait do you think planners in local authorities are with the demands of decarbonisation and when they're looking at housing plans?
If I can start from the policy end to help the planners, we in Scotland brought out Section 7 sustainability, and that was a sort of a follow-on from what England did with Code for Sustainable Homes, but we were different because in Section 7 in Scotland under sustainability, which sets bronze, silver, gold, and we've not yet written platinum, but basically by that means we wanted, if you want silver standard, every element of your house, energy, water, has to be silver. Whereas in England, with the code, you could pick or choose. So it actually created in England a complication for the building control body dealing with the planners, because they were choosing, I'll have a code level 4 home in Norwich and I'll have a code level 5 in Northampton or something, and it created a problem. Whereas here in Scotland we've got a level playing field where the government's saying if you want public housing, we want silver, Section 7 sustainability, so that helps the planners in terms of what they're asking for. In terms of the building control, I think there's certainly further information and training that they would probably appreciate, particularly with some of the new technologies which are coming. And I don't want to get into Green Deal now, but it's all interlinked with something else about how we bring and test products. But planning-wise, we've got Section 7. Building control-wise, I think there's probably some further assistance required.
Okay, we are straying into the arena of the local government committee, who are also looking at this. So unless you've got very brief comments.
Very briefly, just in relation to district heating, where I think local authorities will have a critical role to play, I think there is, and this is one of the recommendations in the Expert Commission's summary report, that local authorities need to be supported in order to not only do the heat mapping, but to target the rollout of district heating in such a way that makes best use of the heat density in their areas and brings the whole network together. It's a coordination role that requires local authorities to be able to champion it, and there's a steep learning curve there for many, I think.
Okay, Jill McCall.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, I was going to ask a question about forestry, but before I do that, because of my colleague raised the issue of zero carbon houses, I just wanted to mention the fact that there's a development in the south of Scotland, the Dalton estate, Dormant Estate in Dalton, which is built to passive house standards and run by a private landlord. So in the context of our earlier evidence session, not all private landlords are completely uncaring about the energy bills of their tenants. But I just wondered about these passive house standards, which I understand are set in Germany, and where they fit into what Professor Smith was talking about, the different definitions of zero carbon. And given that they're up and working, does that not provide a template for other developments?
Yeah, okay. The passive house standard is a German model, and it drives a very, very, what we call low level of airtightness in the building. So a high level of airtightness, a very low value that we record in terms of air leakage. So, for example, they're typically about 0.5 cubic meters. I won't go into all the details, but whereas typically now we would have built, a 5 or 6 home in terms of air tightness values. The lower that value, then the less leakage that you have. But then once you get below 5, you really need to introduce what we call mechanical ventilated and heat recovery type systems, etc. So there are additional costs when you go to that passive level, because the air quality in that premises, when you get down below 4 and 3 values, which passive house goes to, there are additional costs. There's also the issue of the Scottish passive version, which CCG have done through in Glasgow very successfully, and others too. And the Housing Innovation Showcase has 3 in Glenrothes has 3. Sorry, Dunfermline has 3 houses built to 2010, 2013, and 2016 standards. And Edinburgh Napier Scottish Energy Centre is monitoring real time all of that information that's coming from the 27 houses which are on that site. Can we achieve passive? Yes, we can. How long did it take for Austria or Germany to roll it out? It took about 15 to 16 years for them to produce even 8,000 units a year. Scotland typically produces 25,000 units a year. In a good year in 2007, the UK produced 200,000 new homes a year. So it's nowhere near the level that we would need to in terms of to rapidly pull it in. Is the technology ready for Scotland? Not entirely. The jury's out by some of the issues which happen with a Scottish climate versus a German climate, and we just have to be cautious to that. I'm not the expert in that area, but I would refer to other experts if required if you wanted further information.
Is Mr Atkins an expert in the
Yeah. Well, I've certainly spent a lot of time looking at passive house, and Sean's identified a lot of the issues. I think understanding perhaps the drivers of where it's come from in Austria and Germany and Switzerland is quite interesting. The Swiss have a thing called Minergie, which is a very, very similar sort of level of standards, which is all about lower air infiltration levels and mechanical vent. It's partly predicated, I think, on the fact that their carbon balance on their energy generation is very different, particularly in Switzerland, where I think most of their energy generation is hydro and nuclear. So there's a driver for making buildings work on electricity, which at the moment I suspect we don't have, because electricity has the highest carbon footprint in terms of the UK, in terms of the calculation methodologies. I also have those concerns that if you build a completely sealed building, you are relying on some mechanical system. And I was at a very interesting conference earlier last week looking at some of the results of the impact on the filters within these systems and how quickly they can clog up. And depending on the indoor air quality, depending on whether you're a smoker or you've got pets, you can clog these systems up quite quickly. And I was astonished to find out a set of filters replaced every 3 months for a MVHR unit were costing the client £200 a year, which effectively is the same as part of your fuel bill. You're displacing it with that. Who knows what happens when there's a power cut? And we have a very different climate. So I think there's a lot we can learn from passive house standards. We can certainly learn a lot in terms of some of the quality of workmanship on site and in terms of some of the quality of the components. Whole scale moving that into Scotland and saying, right, we just do it that way, I'm unconvinced that it's suited to the Scottish climate as well.
Okay, thanks very much. And can I ask my question about forestry as well?
You're dangerous trains and technically the rule of fingers coming.
Am I? Right.
Unless you can tweak it onto
Right,
building materials.
I'll tweak it onto building materials because actually I did. You're talking about, someone mentioned the house builders being incredibly risk averse. I recently visited James Jones timber sawmill in Lockerbie, and they were making exactly the same point, and that their clients are extremely cost conscious, and I wondered what policymakers can do to encourage the use of timber as a building material, given that house builders are so risk averse.
Just to be fair to James Jones and the timber element and to the house builders, it's not the price of timber, it's what's happened to the price of the masonry sector and the laying of blocks and bricks. That price has gone down through the floor almost. Whereas before, when we were building a lot of homes, there was a higher price, and so down south in England, timber was becoming more attractive. With the current economic downturn, the necessity of speed, the the sustainability drivers, the building on older registered sites under older building regulations. They're not needing the same sustainability drives that timber provides to them, and therefore they've gone back to masonry. Now, if you think that in the coming years, irrespective, and quite where they're going to come from, I'm not sure, but we need to build 290,000 homes in this country across the United Kingdom every year till 2031. Every year. And the only way that will happen will be off-site construction, coming back to the comment made earlier about the good quality, the improved performance, better thermal performance as well. Scotland leads in off-site. Scottish Government did a study which we undertook for them. And to that end, that's where timber will come back much more into the fore. So certainly in the short term just now, they're finding it difficult. But we're already starting to see with some of the RSLs, and again, thanks to the housing associations, they are looking at the new standards, they are building to the new standards, and in which case they will predominantly use timber. So to that end, I think that's good. But the house builders, yes, it is bottom line just now. If they've got existing land, they will use some of that older land, and it's not under the newer regs.
I think there is another big issue in terms of the use of indigenous Scottish timber. The vast majority of construction timber used in Scotland is imported, and there's a perception that Scottish timber is of a lower grade because it grows quicker. I think every other tree in Scotland is a Sitka spruce, and it's seldom used. I've used Sitka spruce, and if you know how to use it and you use it in the right place and the right way, it is perfectly fit for function and incredibly economic because nobody else is using it. But again, it comes back to this lack of knowledge throughout the industry and this level of risk averseness of, does it come with the right certification? Have we seen someone else do it? If it all goes wrong, what are the implications if we built the structure of a building out of something like this that we don't know about? What does our NHBC guarantee require us to do before we can sell our house? You know, you can see all the reasons for not doing anything different from what you've done before. And that is why the construction industry, notwithstanding the fact that all the products exist and the technology exists, and many of them have been proven, all these things stop the mainstream part of the industry from changing from one methodology to another one, even on a slight scale.
We predict that within 10 years' time, 50% of all timber frame housing, which is 75% of all new house built, will be homegrown. We'll be using homegrown timber. Okay.
Are you talking about the Scottish or the UK context?
We're talking about using... Scotland has about 50 to 45% of the UK timber supply. Yeah. And there's 40,000 jobs in Scotland.
It's good news for Scotland in terms of the industry.
It is happening now, but we can't tell you where. But we'll tell you as soon as we can. But there's things being built right now in Scotland using the homegrown timber, which are going to be assessed and other things. But there's some great work going on in that area.
Good.
Marco?
I just have a brief follow-on question to the points that Alison Johnson was raising earlier about CCS, and probably best directed to Dr. Gardner. You proposed a policy, I suppose, of some kind of CCS requirement on new gas, so as to ensure that what is set out in the RPP transpires. And I see from it that it projects 2 gigawatts of gas capacity coming online in 2020 and 500 megawatts of CCS being operational. So I would assume you'd be looking at something like a 25% requirement on any new plant. But what I would be keen to know is, if Scotland was to do that unilaterally, and well, I'm a noted unilateralist in other circles, what would stop a power developer, a power company, putting their power plant next to Berwick or Carlisle and therefore turning them into a Tijuana of electricity, especially since we're going to have upgraded interconnectors to send renewable energy south? What would stop an unabated plant being built, or indeed a nuclear plant being built and sending the energy in the other direction? Is that not where we need some kind of synchronicity?
To start off, I would say that it's important that WWF doesn't think there is a need. In fact, the evidence shows us that there isn't a need for new coal or gas plants in Scotland. In fact, the work that we've had commissioned for us by Garrett Hassan has shown that we can have a very secure, completely secure electricity supply entirely on renewables, albeit with greater interconnection to the rest of the UK and with a greater emphasis on demand-side measures. So the Scottish Government's presumption of a need of a minimum of 2.5 gigawatts of gas is not one that we would support, but if they are going to make that commitment to having a level of thermal power, then it has to come with some assurances as to how they're going to also achieve their decarbonised target. And that's a product of the fact that Scotland is following through on its commitments under its climate change obligations, and it's following the advice of the CCC, and that's so it has to kind of match its policy to that. Specifically on whether or not you'd get a gas-fired power station in Berwick, I think is highly unlikely. You get your thermal power base typically happening in a location where there has already been one. So in Scotland, in all likelihood, if we get new gas-fired power stations, there will be one built in Cockenzie, which is consented but isn't under construction, and possibly one at Longannet if that transition was to happen. So you're not going to get one shifting south of the border in that sense.
Even with the multi-billion pound upfront cost of installing CCS at, for example, Cockenzie?
Well, that we don't have that as yet, and I would suggest that we don't need to have that additional cost burden both on the consumer and on the industry to build such a gas-fired power station when we can be investing in interconnection renewables and actually giving far greater priority to energy demand reduction, both at the homeowner level but also at the industrial scale level, and that's where the energy bill that's going through the UK Parliament at the moment is a very welcome opportunity that looks like it might be missed with a lack of emphasis on demand-side reduction measures. I think the onus is very much on the Scottish Government to follow through on its description of a decarbonised power sector by 2030 with a much greater clarity as to how it intends to achieve it. The renewables aspect, the renewables roadmap is very clear. The energy efficiency contribution is set out in the Energy Efficiency Action Plan, but we're waiting still for the final electricity generation policy statement, which is in its second draft and will be published at some stage this year. But that has to provide some assurance that if there is to be gas-fired power station in Scotland, that it operates in such a way that's consistent with our decarbonised power sector.
I think at that point we can draw matters to a close. Thank you to our witnesses for coming along. I'm sorry we're a little bit behind the clock, but I'm grateful to you for your answers, and you give us a lot of food for thought, so thank you very much. And at this point, we move into private session, so I'll have a very brief suspension.